Garrett. Hal Miller. Matt Taylor. Ryan Jones.
We must please spelling it for Louise.
Thank you very much. And Councilmember Stephen Hales, this is you. We're pleased to be joined by Brent Taylor, whose title is Certified Building Inspector 1 in Redevelopment Department of the City. He has joined us to offer a prayer and to introduce himself and the role that he has in the administration.
Okay. Our dear Father in heaven, as we come to the opening of this Provo City Council workshop meeting, we ask for thy spirit and guidance to be with each member here in this room. We thank thee for the work that they do for us, and we thank thee for the issues that they face. And we ask that you'll bless them as they face these issues, that they will understand and be able to put forth the right, correct answer to help Provo City be the best city there is. At this time, Father, we're truly grateful. We're truly grateful for this time of season. We ask that we may remember those in need, that we'll be able to help them. We ask that you'll bless their food that has been prepared here for them. And we say this prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right, my name's Brent Taylor, building inspector. I'm over the counter in the building department over there. So when people come in for permits and things like that, they get to face me. So I handle all the issues of permits coming in, making sure that they're properly gone through the right departments, and then they get issued back out, and make sure inspections and things like that are going smooth, and make sure that people in Provo, when they come here, they're happy to be here in Provo and be part of Provo. And Matt Taylor is my second cousin. You want to be announced that. When Matt first day I came, I've been here at Provo City 10 years on the 20th of this month. And so it doesn't seem like it. I've enjoyed what I do. I'm a master plumber by trade. I'm still very involved in the plumbing aspect. I taught an apprenticeship program now. I'm in my 25th year of teaching. And I'm also ICC certified. I do classes for the state. I'm a licensed state instructor and everything. So I do get called out for the code to go interpret it. So, but I do enjoy working with each and every one of you. And the mayor, Wayne, you guys are great. Council. So
You're very kind. Other questions?
10 years, you said?
yes, Gary.
And I'm, and I don't know what it is. Over the last few years, and even before I went on the council, I felt a little bit of an attitude change about people when they walk in your door. You face a tough situation because you have to do a lot of things that people don't want to do.
Yeah.
And yet, I really have felt a change in our city where people are saying that the people behind the counter now are really trying to help rather than confuse or frustrate. I really feel that, and I'm grateful for the attitude. I walk in there, even before I was on the council, I was happy to see those guys, even if I had to do certain things that I wasn't sure I wanted to do at times. Yeah. But I'm very grateful for them and their attitude. They have a great attitude there.
And I'll second that. I've enjoyed Brent for a lot of years. I don't like it when he takes our money. But they're so good to help you and do things best.
Those fees might be going up.
He's just doubled. No.
It's the community. It's the face of it.
That's right.
You mentioned, use the word smooth. That's the sort of the standard.
Hope
for
yes.
Standard. What are the 2 or 3 reasons, in your very educated opinion, for it not to be smooth when it isn't?
When it isn't, well, we have all different types of situations. People building without a permit. That's not a smooth situation. Trying to tell them they need a permit, and when it's not smooth is when the plan isn't getting through the process. You know, people are very impatient. A lot of times it might have to do with the builder or the homeowner themselves not having the proper stuff in. And we're waiting on them, but they feel that we should just, you know, have it out for them as they walk in with what we need. But we try over there to make sure everybody's taken care of the same and treat everybody the same. And got a wonderful secretary, Alyssa, and we work good together, and we seem to make, we want people to go out with a smile on their face, not grumpy.
Thank you for doing so well.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome. See you.
Thanks, Mike.
See you.
I invite a motion to approve the minutes of the following meetings: July 17th, 2014, Provo City, Orange City Municipal Council joint meeting minutes, August 5th, 2014 work meeting, August 19th, 2014 work meeting, September 12th, 2014 special meeting, September 16th, 2014 work meeting, October 7th, 2014 work meeting, October 10th, 2014 work meeting, October 21st, 2014 work meeting, and November 11th, 2014 work meeting. Are there recommended changes to any of the minutes?
I guess, now that I think about it, there were a couple, but they were just like, they were minor. I mean, it wasn't, as far as the substance, it was just a follow-up. It's like, yeah, it was, yeah. But everything else was great. I mean, she was great to work with.
A motion, please. Thank you. A second. Mr. Van Buren, second. Ms. Santiago made the motion. All in favor? Thank you. The motion passes unanimously. Mr. Hale's excused. We now turn to Ms. Santiago for a presentation by the Council Budget Committee and discussion establishing an outcome policy for the cost recovery of user fees.
Okay, thank you. I'm just trying to move to the right screen here. So last meeting we discussed, we have a PowerPoint by Larry Walters of the Budget Committee, and we discussed a way to recover user fees, and we asked our staff to put together a resolution that outlined some of those things that we wanted to look at. One was to recover the direct costs of our the direct costs, and the other was to also recover some of the indirect costs according to a template that we would have Denise Roy put together a list of all of the fees and according to community benefit, and then we would go through that list and kind of decide where we felt things should be placed. And after doing that, we would have the direct cost plus a percentage of the indirect cost that we could recover. And this would be one of the puzzle pieces that we have as a budget committee in recovering, so not only recovering our costs, but also creating a sustainable budget over the next 10 years, which is in our Vision 2030. That's a goal of ours to have a sustainable budget in the long term. And this is one of those puzzle pieces that will help us be able to do that. So our staff has put together this resolution. We did decide to discuss it in work session today and then in our regular meeting, so that we would give Mayor and his staff time to look at it and to give recommendations. And I believe he has some things that he'd like to discuss. Sorry, you take
But
that.
we might provide a kind of overture by simply looking at the last paragraph, proposed resolution. The council is requesting there to list the cooperation and support of the executive branch for the policies stated herein, and declares its intent and consider these policies to be evaluated future Provo City budgets.
Thank you. I've expressed to the chairman and Ms. Santiago on just for a half a second, we had the chance to talk before, that I'm highly supportive of the direction and applaud the efforts of the council and the budget committee with the goals, the stated goals, and want to be very supportive. And hesitate almost to say anything because I don't want it to be interpreted as less than supportive of what you're doing and accomplishing in some really, I think, important things. You sense there's a but coming with that statement, and there is. Probably my biggest concern would focus on two things. One is potentially monumental task of this analysis, and the potential that task would have to clog the system both for the administration and the council. That if we were tasked, let's hypothetically say that we were tasked with the researching and doing and preparing the data and bringing that to the council, I actually anticipate that some of this, the decisions placed before the council would not be simple and could be quite long in duration. And perhaps one example would be if that recommendation came back to change recreation fees, the recreation center fees. That's not a simple, I don't think that's not a simple discussion. If, let's suppose hypothetically that it says that we should now charge $10 for a day fee and double the amount of the residents, the family pass. I think that would take some time to analyze and decide if that's the right thing to do for our community. And if it's not 10, is it 7, is it 6, is it 550? And the number of things like that could be legion and be quite a task and overwhelm land use planning and other things that were before the council. And at the same time, be quite overwhelming for the administration to prepare the data for you. I also, to be frank, worry that some of those decisions would be so difficult that the research would be done and that we would decide then not to change the fees. And I think that we need to be honest with ourselves that potential exists. I point to the resolution that we did, a joint resolution with the City Council and the administration about increasing property tax to stay current with inflation. And the administration went and prepared a budget that did that, and then we felt like that was not the right thing to do after that. And so my suggestion to the council would be not to change your direction, because I think it's a good direction and a healthy direction, but just to slow down a little bit and perhaps task John Borgett, his awesome department, and Denise, with a handful of user fees to go research and bring back and maybe specifically to find some that they anticipate would be easy and some that would be hard to change, hard to research and hard to change, and see how we deal with those and see how much time they take and how long it takes them to research them. They feel like they could be prepared with a half a dozen or more or less for the January meeting, where they could present them to you in the format that you'd like to see to make the discussions. And that's a more comfortable thing for me to commit to and to see how we do than to jump in and say, yeah, we're going to do this with every user fee and use this formula and adjust them accordingly.
Questions?
And this kind of goes in hand hold with what the mayor just talked about. When we tried to do business fees, I just remember we had this. We had the same kind of motivation is we need to recoup what it costs us. And so we went back and spent a lot of time on committees and did that. We got it all done, and the pushback was so strong that we just said, can't do that. So I'm in favor of what we're trying to do. I'm just not sure when we get after all that work, and when we get to the point of actually changing those fees, and we hear the pushback, how committed or how...
We actually reduced business license fees.
Yeah, we went the other way when we got to doing that, and so that's where my the unknown is just kind of.
Do you sense that the language of this resolution imposes a binding commitment on the recommendations that would be forthcoming, that is, after term completed? Any recommendations, or is it more a request for information and a proposal for the amended user fee structure schedule, but leaving the ultimate decisions to the discretion of the council? So we're not going into it with the same assumption that whatever comes out is something honest. I don't sense that.
And I didn't feel that real strongly, and I didn't look at it a lot with that in mind that way.
Nor do I sense there being any time limit is imposed here. It's a request being made. So that may need to soften that a bit more.
One thing that I'm interested in is the direct costs. And I think we as a council really, I don't know how everybody, I feel that we need to at least cover our direct costs. And I don't know how, John, Denise, how close are we? Is there very many people, fees that we're not covering all of our direct costs?
Well,
I don't know if we know that right now.
so let me throw out the recreation center as a good example, because that's one we're still familiar with. We're not coming close to covering direct costs.
And there's a problem. I appreciate that, because now we're deciding what's the good for the community. And so this is a very challenging task. And the other thing that I am a little concerned about is the last statement, to identify with respect to any user fee for which the fee is not set at the cost plus level a specific alternative source to recover the foregoing revenue. Because I start looking at those things, okay, well then if we're not quite recovering, maybe we ought to take it from, and who's recommending that? Is the administration going to recommend that, and they'll come back to the council with that?
So can I get a point of clarification on that? Because your email was clear that it was the council. As we read the resolution, I'm sorry, your email was clear that it was the administration. As we read the resolution, it seems to be the council.
I think it would be the council that would decide. So if we decide that something was more of a community benefit, but there's a shortfall there, where is that money going to come from? So we're on a fiscally sort of unsustainable path as far as our budget goes into the next 10 years. And so as we looked at this, we decided, well, we have direct costs that we're not recouping. It's the cost, and we're subsidizing that. And we can't afford to subsidize that. And so by recouping the direct costs, and then we also have indirect costs that we can't necessarily afford to keep subsidizing. So we're trying to take a percentage of those indirect costs. So I think that when it comes to some of these fees, it might be difficult, but it's the cost. It's our cost. It's the cost of doing business. And if they're not paying it, we're subsidizing it. And we can't afford to subsidize it. So I think that's where we're coming from, is we need to find a way to recover these direct costs and even some of the overhead, some of these indirect costs, to be able to have a sustainable budget. And this is just one part of what we're trying to do.
And that is the perpetual question in my mind, is because they're going to say, okay, well, we're going to take it out. If we agree that this needs to be subsidized, we take it from somewhere. Is it going to be the golf course?
Well, they may not necessarily be taking it, or will we raise the revenue through some other means? Property tax or rap tax?
Nothing in this undercuts the legislative authority of the municipal council with respect to approving the budget. This is all part of approving the budget. But the architecture of the budget, the amendment of the budget, the redesign, vision of the budget, new ways of costing, so it's very much the business of the administration. And we look to them to provide us with the information that we need. It's not something that we could undertake independently. We haven't the resources. Don't want
the knowledge.
resources
Right.
for that.
I'm sorry, read.
And I think it's important to hear from those who will be doing the work with respect to the mayor's proposal that we essentially sample from those accounts that would likely be much more required in terms of the size of the money involved and the complexity of the account as opposed to those not so required. And by the January meeting, have a sense of perhaps productive way, directions in which to proceed, as to accomplish as much as we can for the next budget and beyond. Is what's your? I'd like to know your impression of that suggestion.
Sure. As we talked about last month, one of the negatives about the sample approach is that you don't know how much of your overall overhead you're incurring, but it does give you a good indication of the process of finding out if the council has the will to make those changes that come back as a result of the analysis. And I think it really does provide a time frame to where we're not going to be spending an inordinate amount of time to come up with a sampling of how it's going to work, and then it gives you a little more information as you're evaluating. But at the end of the day, you're going to know how much overhead you would recover as a result of the sample fees, but you won't know as far as the overall goal.
Which is some confidence in the book. And it's always possible, John, correct me if I'm wrong, that further research as this becomes more comprehensive across all of the user fee accounts in the city, what you found by sampling may in fact be revised later as the fuller picture comes into view.
Yep.
And we have to understand that.
At the sake of not wanting to derail your current resolution, we did take an opportunity to revise it, and if you don't mind, I'll pass this around, which would accommodate more of a gradual approach.
Can you tell us briefly what the changes?
Yes, I'm going to pass a copy around. It's marked in red. That'll come to you in just a moment. But, primarily, there's some subtle changes, but the primary one is that this says 6 to 8 user fees. We select 6 to 8 user fees to come and reevaluate in January, and it softens some of the language where we would. For instance, Part 1, line 44, it says it's the policy and intent of municipal council to accept rather than to implement it. It softens, I think, some of the kind of the inferred, wow, this is what we're going to do with every one of these. I would also like to just suggest two things, and the chairman will attest to the fact that I don't do this lightly, and tossed and turned a lot last night on how to present some of these thoughts. One is that as a government, most of what we do is subsidized because we do a lot of things that people wouldn't do. We build roads, we build airports, we build bridges. I would hate to even know how much it costs an individual rider to ride front runner back and forth. It costs $500 million just to put it in. So I think your $11 is probably operational, not even counting the $500 million. And so I would be careful with our paradigm of doing that, because, for instance, would our residents wanted the rec center built if they had to pay $20 when they walk up to the door instead of $5 for it? And so we do a lot of things like that as a government. And I don't think we can. I don't think it's realistic to say we're going to put them all into a category where everything is not subsidized, because that's what we do. The second thing is this, and this one I'm most uncomfortable with, is this concept of an unsustainable budget. I'll be the first to sign on to the information that's been presented about this gap that grows, and yet every year we balance the budget, and we make it work. And I think we need to be a little careful sometimes not to go overboard to pull those lines together 10 years out, because we'll pull them together. We always have. And most families' budgets don't look a whole lot different than this. And I say this very carefully because I do not want to lose sight of the goal of pulling those lines together. I just say that I think that you do need to realize, just like your family budget, you don't know how you're going to get your kids through BYU, and yet you do. And every year when we sit down with John and Denise, we don't know how we're going to make a balance, and yet we do. And sometimes as you free up revenue, all you've really done is open the gap for additional spending because the pressure is there to spend that.
I think from the budget committee perspective, though, there's an 11% transfer from utilities, and so when the utilities go up, we're paying for our utilities, but we're also paying for that 11% that's going elsewhere. And I think as far as transparency, and having a sustainable budget, having those those monies come from areas where they could. So user fees, where we can get some of those monies from user fees. If it's recreation, getting some of those monies from, say, a RAP tax. If it's, having when the money comes in, having it go. So when people pay their water bill, they know they're getting the infrastructure for the water, and 11% of that's not going for other things. Because in our capital improvement projects for water and for energy and those things are not. We have lots of capital improvement projects that are waiting for funding, like the ultraviolet lighting instead of the chlorine for wastewater, for instance. There are certain things that are on hold because there's no funding for them, capital improvement projects. So I think from the budget committee, we're trying to see how we can bring in money so that we can actually address and have some sort of a source to take care of some of those capital improvement projects that aren't going to be, they're not sellers for the public. You can't sell, wastewater treatment, for let's raise taxes for that, right? So some of those things, I think that's where we're trying to free up some money there. And I guess.
Sure, and I don't want to be seen as opposing those efforts because they're great efforts. But let me come back to the library. So are we really willing to charge only those people who go to the library what it really costs to maintain that library? And I don't, my guess is if we bring that to the council, the answer is no. And yet we could spend a year researching what that cost and tie up the resources of the finance department to come give you that answer. And if I know beforehand you're going to say, no, I don't want to let them go do that.
For the card, to have a library card.
To walk in the door.
Or to walk in.
Yeah. I mean, because our model over there is not cost recovery.
I wonder if there's another way to characterize this. That is, rather than assuming that whatever analysis the finance department is asked to make becomes the platform or the predicate for a decision about budget, we could rather think of it as asking them to do the research that would allow as much information as possible to be available for our budgetary decisions. Recognizing that in many cases, well, it will depend a good deal on the tier structure that is yet to be developed. But I doubt that there would be many cases in which the tier, the specified tier, mismatches the interest of the council. Now, we need to be prepared for that eventuality. But in the case that you raise, of course not, we say at this point in time. But it would be still of interest to the council to know about direct and indirect costs with respect to the library and to feel confident about those data. Does that make sense?
It does. My wife, whenever I tell her how many calories are in something, tells me she doesn't want to know. So part of me says, careful what you ask for. It never tastes the same again after you know. But I don't think that's good fiscal policy to pretend not to know. So I agree with that. I do think, as I understand the model that we would end up on, you're still going to be guessing at cost as it relates to indirect cost, the ability to bore down exactly, and you're going to put them into percentages and things, and so we won't know exactly. And if the work it takes to bring you the answer is worth knowing if you're not going to act on it, then I'm okay with it. But I think the council should at least think through that before they ask us to do it.
I share an observation. Sure. The topic about the calories resonates. I was joking, crying last night about that scene from A Few Good Men. You can't handle the truth. And I think my experience over the last 4 years of the council, there are situations like that. And I think this library example, the rec center example, are good examples where it's just going to be really difficult for you to raise or to adopt that type of cost recovery. But there may be other things where that makes all the sense in the world. And so again, that comment of, hey, knowing the truth, even if we don't act to make a change, is helpful because that's a conscious decision. Now it's just not accepting what's been given you. You consciously thought it through and you consciously said, yes, we are subsidizing this. We know exactly what it's costing us to subsidize. And there's power behind that. My final thought is, if that type of information is valuable to the council, and I personally think it is, you may want to consider funding the finance department with resources, another part-time position or full-time position, with the idea of do they earn their own pay? Do they generate enough analysis that they would essentially pay for themselves plus recover? Now, I see the mayor's fine. I don't think necessarily likes that idea. But if it's that valuable, I know that the finance department, they will never, and I doubt the mayor or Wayne will come out and say, hey, they're tapped out. I can probably doubt they're tapped out. I can, just knowing, watching from the sidelines, I know they're tapped out. And so I think that's part of the hesitancy of the administration is, it's sort of like the code cleanup, right? For me to do that, even 1 or 2 items a month, I got to have an intern. To really ask the finance department to do 8 or 10 fee cleanups a month, one, they're tapped out. It's going to be really difficult for them to maintain that with their current resource load. 2, they'll also consider the amount of resources it will take for you to evaluate that. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Again, I've already stated I think it's a valuable exercise, but
I'm quite sure we have adequate resources.
So
the answer is the council will do this. And we're,
let me ask Ms. Santiago, does the level of alteration that we see in the proposed amended resolution strike you as a reason to return to the committee for their opinion?
I think so. I think what the committee is looking for is not really a commitment going forward, but kind of the same thing that the mayor's concerned about is let's decide if it's something which is really a priority of the council, which we've already decided that when we listed our priorities in that little exercise. We did, sort of say that this was a priority for us, right?
Yes.
And user fees, looking at user fees was part of our priority. And I think they're just looking for a little confidence as well that this is something that the council is willing to pursue, even though it's going to be difficult. Like going forward, it's going to be difficult. There will be things that will come up.
Is there any language here that suggests otherwise?
It's, as you said, it's a lot more, it's a lot softer.
I think it's intended to be preliminary. It's not
Yeah.
intended to be the final
It's-
word, certainly.
right.
But it's sort of intended to say, we think there's some due diligence to do here before we fully implement. So the intent was to essentially buy 30 days of time in which we could begin that due diligence process and give you enough information then to finalize a resolution shortly thereafter.
That's the tension. Referring to the committee would be that the work would not start.
Mhm. So, I guess we can decide, the committee felt like we would get a better picture. We don't know what all of our costs are, so it would be good to know all at once what the costs are. And we have a better understanding and be able to, I don't know.
That's a position, as I recall Dr. Walter's comment at various points during the discussion of this presentation. That is a kind of high-level preference without knowing much about the realities of extracting the data, providing the database. It strikes me that this is a kind of trial balloon that stops short of saying that we're conduct a comprehensive analysis of fees, but instead to sample different categories of fees, and possible tiers of fees. Do the analysis for those and come back and share with you what that was like.
Realizing it could be very different with the other departments as well.
I think we would be better if we had much experience at all.
And I would look to you council members who have been here and been through the business license fee, process as well. I haven't been through that process, so I'm feeling like let's do it all. Let's do it. But I do.
As we talked about this as whether we could get this information, and I remember John and Denise saying it was going to be a variable process to go to all the department heads, but it was something they thought we could at least get the directors figure out some of those direct costs. The indirects were going to be even harder. Tell me how you feel about that. Are we still? It sounds like a real challenge as we hear this now, and yet I think the committee was kind of saying, well, can we do that? And we were encouraged. They thought that was a possibility.
Well, I'd say long term, I think from an idealistic standpoint, it would be awesome if each of our departments had a similar tool or the same tool, and we were consistently applying that to determine what our direct costs are and what our recommendations are for fees going forward. That would be my goal long term. I really think that it's critical that the departments understand what goes into it. I mean, they typically and traditionally have always kind of been the ones that have instigated and have done a lot of the groundwork for doing fee comparisons and fee studies. And so the finance, we're kind of in a little bit of a we're off on our own. We're not out working day to day with the services that they provide. So ideally, we would provide the tools to the departments so they could understand what their costs are, and then they could come back, work with the administration, and then work with the council to determine what fee it is that they want to implement. But I do support the merit approach because it's a little uncertain where it would go after that process is done, and so I think for this initial phase, the finance could work with the departments and come up with a select group of fees and come back and kind of show you the results and see, actually talk specifically about what the impacts are of making these fee changes, whether it's something that you're politically behind or whatnot, and go through that whole process and then make the decision. But long-term, I don't see and wouldn't recommend us hiring somebody else in finance and just having them do the rate analysis on all the departments. I would rather see long-term working with the departments and training them and educating them so that we're using a good, sound tool to analyze our fees.
And at this point, you don't feel we have a tool?
Well, we've worked on this template, and I think we've made a lot of progress on it.
On this particular template that's before us now?
Yeah, and that template, it may evolve as we implement it or as we look at it, but right now that template is the tool that I'm referring to, or something like that that you could do. So at least you have it consistently applied.
So it's possible that this evening's meeting, we could adopt this amended resolution with the proviso that we will look forward to the report from Untitled, as well as making that report available to the council budget committee, and then ask that committee to recommend even further revision of the resolution with those findings in hand. Alternatively, we could simply make a request that the project that is a sample, simply go ahead in the absence of a resolution, and wait for those data and return to the matter of the resolution later on.
Yeah, and I would like a chance to read through it, a little more carefully rather than just glancing through the.
There's certainly no pride of authorship if changes are suggested. That I think the intent is clear. What we're trying to accomplish with the changes.
And would you feel comfortable if we were to simply ask you to pursue the project?
Even without the resolution? Absolutely, yes. Yeah, I think that's clear that we all feel like it'd be a great thing to go see, to go implement the formula and try it on some of these and bring them to you.
Further discussion?
Yeah, I think Matt mentioned in one of our budget committee meetings, when you went through the business license, that whole process, Matt, could you explain the difference between what that process was like and what we have now that would make this a little bit different as far as using the template and having this, the other caveat where we actually need to provide the funding for whatever we decide wouldn't be in that cost plus payment.
If I'm not answering the question right,
Okay.
reiterate.
Okay.
My observation is that when the council previously dealt with fees in general, this was about 4 years ago, as part of the sustainable budget effort, they did adopt an intent statement to evaluate user fees, or to at least look at them. Specifically, we had a presentation from Dan Follett at the time of business license fees. And under recently amended or new state legislation that said, particularly tied to the Good Landlord Program. So there was follow-up to that idea with another council intent statement that said, basically just go study this and come back with a report. That was the limit of the council's policy, was go study this. Funding was actually appropriated in that case for a consultant, and they came back and studied it. Actually having an outside consultant, they did good work, but as we reviewed it, we noticed a few things that had to scratch our head on and evaluate. So there are some advantages of in-house of having that deeper understanding of what's really happening and how things work. But not to fault the report, at the end of the day, I think one of the challenges was, even though the council had said, yes, let's go study this, there wasn't really a firm, I don't want to say political commitment, but there wasn't a firm articulation of why we're doing this, how committed we are to actually acting upon this study and or a philosophy about thinking about this. And so when it got into the actual evaluation, this is just my observation from the sidelines, it seemed difficult for the council to articulate why we're actually doing this, other than just raising revenue. Okay, and how you actually go about dealing with or thinking about the model in which you do raise revenue was absent from that discussion.
Man, I'm going to disagree with you on that a little bit, because we talked about costs and direct costs and all the police, and then there was the indirect. It was a lot the same type of conversation, I thought.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. But your policy statement, when you started the process, simply said study the issue. Now, the result of that study was, here's direct costs, here's indirect costs. But the council hadn't proactively formed a philosophy around how you're going to deal with direct and indirect costs. You were left dealing with that on an ad hoc basis or a by meeting per meeting basis in trying to figure out in just a group discussion in the heat of the moment.
With mad presidents.
Okay, with residents and public there, comment. So you had all the study and data, but you were trying to figure out what to do with it in the heat of the moment. And I think that's the big difference about this policy outcome. And this is very much tied to sort of the policy governance model. What are you trying to accomplish? And you pre-think about those things before you actually even do anything. And now when those things come back to you, you can then evaluate how well does the proposal reflect our policy outcome.
And one of the challenges with some of those direct costs and the same we're going to deal with here are so subjective. That there are certain things, well, this is really, is this a benefit or is it actually a cost?
So that was part of the purpose of developing a framework about thinking about cost recovery. Okay, we know that in certain instances we're going to have to subsidize. And so how do we do that in a more or a less subjective way? Yes, there's still some subjectivity to it, obviously, but at least there's a framework about thinking about how you might approach that. Rather than dealing with it in the heat of the moment in the middle of the meeting, you've preliminarily pre-decided, okay, this is how we're going to think about it when we're in that moment. And that's going to provide us a framework for dealing with these things when we're reviewing. That's the big difference by considering a policy like this. And I used this example last work session. It's like when I was confronted with cigarettes in high school. I had already pre-decided a policy, a simple policy, no. But that was pre-decided. It made it really easy when I was in the situation to form an answer. That's a similar benefit to saying, this is how we're going to deal with these issues when they come up. And here's how we're going to think about it and react to it. So when you're in this situation, you can always go, well, we've already decided how we're going to deal with this. That's the difference between the process.
And let me ask you a question then, because I thought they had also decided the process, because we had a 30%, a 50%, a 75%, and a 100%. Those were 4 different options that we had.
Those were recommendations that came out of the study. They weren't that wasn't a framework.
We as a council did not predetermine.
Yeah, that was not a framework that you predetermined or a policy that you predetermined. That's something that was thrown upon you. So that's the difference, is being proactive or reactive.
So we as a council had not determined that this is 30% or 20%. And that's what this process, the new process, will do for us.
Well, and what happened was many of those details about, okay, how do we structure it, how do we build the framework, all came up in the meeting, in the heat of the moment. Okay, well, what if we don't do a 30%, 50%? What if we did something else?
Yes.
And so you have several meetings where you're dancing around different ideas about how to construct a model. And then you're dealing with the outliers like IHC and others, and what about them, or startup. And so I think that's the value of the policy governance model, or adopting a policy or statement not that you're married to it, it's just here's how we've decided ahead of time to think about and deal with these things when they come up. Right.
This is probably PR advice instead of legal advice. I think Matt has very accurately and excellently stated the reasons why having the policy before the facts has advantages. Let me just kind of give you a flip side view, which is it can also be potentially dangerous because you have determined the policy in the absence of any facts. And if you determine the policy and then you get the facts and don't follow the policy and abandon the policy, then having stated the policy in the first place looks foolish and naive.
So we found out that we were $2 million short from business license fees. And I don't think we would have ever gone into that saying we're going to raise business license fees by $2 million.
Now, and I agree with Brian.
That's where the singing and the dancing began.
I agree with Brian 100%. That is the flip side, which is one reason when Bryce Mumford initially presented the pyramid framework for thinking about, okay, we know going into this that you're going to be faced with really tough decisions where you're going to be under pressure to say, hey, you know what, this one really is 100% direct or cost recovery. It's subsidized. So if that's the case, and we might actually find that's maybe even more often the case than, you know, that's more often the rule rather than the exception. How do you think about that exception? And that's where the framework for this do we charge a 20, 40, 60, 80, 100% cost recovery? I think the one challenge to the current recommendation is that model was recommended to only apply to indirect costs. I think you're going to be faced where you're going to find the direct costs far exceed your political will to change it. So you may want to consider, does this model apply to dealing with direct costs too? Are there times, and I think you're going to find several instances, the mayor already pointed out a few, where you're going to be saying, yeah, we need to subsidize the direct costs. Okay, how do you do that? And to what level? And so again, that's where I thought the model had some appeal. Because again, I gave you a framework for thinking about, okay, is this a community benefit? Is it an individual benefit? Is it something in between? To help you gauge how much of that direct cost you should subsidize. That's something you didn't have in the last round.
And the question in the model, was the model set up to recover direct costs, and then the percentage I thought was to go for indirect costs? Or are we also putting?
That's correct.
That's what I thought.
Well, that's the current proposal.
Yes, and
that's not to say you couldn't use the model for direct costs.
But the sampling project that the mayor has proposed, heard from finance department, would give us a basis for determining the extent to which the model might that as well embrace direct costs.
Mr. Chair, just as a follow-up, if I might. So and this is maybe an overly simplistic view, but as I'm listening to this, I would characterize the two resolutions that you have in front of you in this way, which is that the original resolution drafted by staff essentially says 100% direct cost recovery is the method. That is our intent. And if you're convinced that is the correct policy in the absence of any facts, then I think that resolution represents that intent, it represents that policy. I think what the mayor is proposing, as I see it, is maybe we don't have enough facts yet to determine that that's the right policy. Let's look at it some more. But so he's proposed a resolution that says we think 100% direct cost recovery might be the right method, but let's gather some data first. That's how I view the two of them being different as far as what you are considering, what your policy is.
But Brian, given that, doesn't that sound like then that the mayor's proposal is saying we're not going to be able to get 100% direct cost recovery on a number of areas? So again, it's the I don't know what you do first. I mean, are there a lot of areas where we're not going to be able to do that? So consequently, the philosophy if we're going to get 100% direct cost recovery isn't.
Which may be an argument for simply directing the administration to proceed with the sample study. And a month hence would be in a better position to frame a policy.
But then we'd have to have we'd have to be quite reliable on the administrations. I mean, they could, not that you do it deceitfully at all, but I mean, it depends on which samples. They could have 6 or 8 samples that are all really hard to get 100% direct cost recovery.
Our intent would be to show you some of each, to try to identify some low-hanging fruit, try to point out some ones that are tough.
And then
we'd be happy to work with the.
We can refer to the study. We can refer the study to our own budget committee.
Yeah, and we certainly would welcome your suggestions as to which fees we looked at, if you had some specific ones that you wanted.
And maybe just that statement's enough to say, let's look at low-hanging, let's have a kind of a cross sample.
Well, and do you know going in what you're going to be
so
the difficult ones?
Let me address Kay's point first, because I'll have fun with this for a moment. I actually would love you to increase fees, because then I get to go out and say, look, it's not my fault.
And you put your arm around me.
You gotta go and say, this is why it's good.
But my point is, so my motivation is actually to increase revenue, right? And to and trust me, I'm so glad this is a hard thing for you when you raise your hand and say, yeah, we're going to change the rec center fee. That's a hard decision. I'm glad I don't have that vote. So I actually think we're probably pretty well positioned to bring you some things because if you can increase revenue, my life is easier. And I think what you'd see from us is a real honest intent to bring you some examples that would help you know if the formula is right, if it needs tweaking, if we want to hone in on certain categories. This approach would also allow us to make decisions that impact the budget that we're going to be working on versus waiting for everything, which is going to be at least the following budget. And you could perhaps get some things very quickly into this year's budget. And so hopefully you don't have to worry about that.
Well, I just didn't know what sample would be the most effective or be the most beneficial to what we get back initially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we could quickly, probably by Thursday, give leadership our list. Is that?
Want to float that to our committee?
Yeah, but I think it'd take us long to get our proposed list, show leadership on Thursday, show it to your committee, and that would give you a chance to react and say, no, take this one out, and I'd like to see this one in.
How long do you think it would take to get all of the direct costs, everything we're asking for? When you say it wouldn't be for this year's budget, but it would be for the next.
If we did all of them?
If you did all of them?
I don't know, because it seems overwhelming, but if we dig in and do some, we may come back and say it wasn't that big a deal. My guess is the second 6 are going to be easier than the first 6 once they kind of get in stride and figure out how we're going to do it. I don't know, John, do you have if you had to do them all at once, when would you be able to come back and?
Well, I think the effort would be for us to work with all the departments, to have the departments work with us to collect the data. But man hours, I mean, it would be a lot of man hours. Some of it would be simultaneously because the department is working on it. But if you took all the time and effort that went into it, and then the end result is not what we hoped it would. If there's not the political will to make the changes, then then there's a concern. You know? But I think this initial effort will give us a good idea about what's involved, and that will help. But it's hard to tell. I mean, each year, what we've typically done with the budget is we've had, 2 or 3 departments take a good look at their fees, but they've never gone to the level that we're talking about, template. Some of them better, some of them have done less. But it could be done, but it would be, it would impact all the departments in the city, and it would take some effort, time for us to coordinate with them. So a lot of work.
And if we did go with the recommendations, ultimately, what do you see that as far as benefit for the future for all of the departments from the city as a whole? Do you feel the cost versus the benefit? I guess is what I'm asking. What are your thoughts on that? We ended up going with this template in the end.
Well, a couple things that long term, if we decided this was a good approach, is that then we're consistently applying the same methodology and factoring our fees throughout the city. We don't have some that are doing it one way, some that are doing it another. Also, I think we provide a good tool to the departments so that because they don't have a lot of the data that we have, like we talked about, as far as what the true cost of an employee is, what their time costs the city, and what the other costs are that go into the fees. I think that education would be good long term. And so, and the other thing that we talked about last time is that you would, if you did it on a regular basis, hopefully make sure that your fees are keeping up with inflation and increasing costs, and so it does provide some benefits there. So long term, yeah, it could be a benefit.
So once again, under promising and over delivering, Wayne Parker has prepared the list of fees that
Just
he's-
ideas. As we're thinking here.
So pass them around.
I don't know if you want him to read them, but Wayne's ready to go.
I can share at least my thoughts that are kind of a balanced group. So would be rec center day use and memberships, which again, we did a good pro forma on a couple of years ago, but we obviously have a lot of new data. Library ballroom rentals, those have not been adjusted in 10 years probably. And we're set, again, politically, because we were trying to stay just above the wedding rental marketplace so that we weren't unfairly competing with the reception centers and so on. So that had no relationship to cost whatsoever. Our ambulance transport and mileage fees, again, the maximums are set by the state. It would be really informative to know how much of our costs we're recovering. General plan amendments, this is one that I think we're probably way under on in terms of our cost. Grave openings and closings at the cemetery, those have not been, again, reset for several years, and labor costs have gone up, fuel costs have gone up, and it's probably worth looking at. Keeping chickens, I recognize that's not a fee that generates a lot of revenue, but it was entirely politically set when we did it. It had nothing to do with cost. It was essentially trying to keep it low enough that we wouldn't dissuade people from getting a permit to have chickens in their backyard. But again, we never asked the cost recovery question. Airport parking fees. This is again one that we set a little bit arbitrarily. It was set basically at 50% of the Salt Lake revenue. But again, I don't think we've done the level of analysis to say what does it cost us to run the system, repave it, restripe it, put up signs. And then the last one, which we already have a request on, is for records fees. Someone comes to the city and says, I want you to go give me all the police reports for accidents at X intersection. Those fees have not been updated in years and years. And 10 cents a photocopy, and we haven't set digital fees. What is it that we charge if we do it in a PDF and email it? And so those were the 8 that I sort of came up with, just not necessarily randomly, but in an attempt to be balanced and give you some things that I think would be really useful data, as well as somewhat balanced. Some are big revenue sources, some are small, some apply and have a broad base of community benefit. Others are very specialized benefit. So anyway, those are just my thoughts, and I'm sure John and Dees have others, but.
I would be very surprised if you didn't raise the majority of those after getting the data.
So if they're set by the state, ambulance transport and mileage, if it's set by the state, we can raise those, or we cannot?
There's a maximum, and we're at the
We're
maximum.
at the maximum, and
Yeah.
we're still not.
Right,
recouping
but again, I think the
it's
data would
high.
give you a good basis to go to the state legislature and say, you're not letting us recover enough.
We'll take bets later.
Yeah.
As I hear Wayne's discussion here, how many did you, 8?
Yeah, these are it, those are.
Okay, how many do we have? I remember we
Oh.
gave a
Remember
list
that
to the budget
spreadsheet?
committee. Yeah, that spreadsheet.
I just-
we get to the council
I
to
just
actually
scrolled-
see all those.
I just
fees.
scrolled through
See what a task
the
it is.
consolidated fee schedule, and it made my finger sore going.
Yeah.
Getting from the
That
top
was
to the
that
bottom.
spreadsheet that I showed on the 11th. That
We
if
did.
you every one of those user fees from the consolidated fee schedule were in one of those columns. So there's
So, I would also
that's up
like,
into there's 300, isn't
Oh,
But
it?
at least
yeah,
over
I'd also like to suggest that we analyze things that should be charged a fee and are not on the schedule. And I don't know that we're ready for any of those, but that's also something that,
If you can think about that.
Well, and that's part of the indirect cost, wasn't it, what we were thinking, or is that something?
We should charge a
something
fee
that,
on
you know,
submissions
we
for city flag design.
I think this is a good sample of some of those fees that we're going to take time to analyze. We're going to take more manpower to analyze what they are than what our cost recovery could be in 10 years. You know, I mean, so that brings me back to the sample of, is there a way to, what's our objective? What's our,
Our objective is a template.
okay.
Is a template that appears to be accurate. That is to say, if given accurate information, then calculates at least two types of costs, direct and indirect, equitably, taking into consideration all that is expended.
So the objective would be the template, the result hopefully would be revenue. But revenue is not the objective. I mean, we're trying to, and if we're going to spend more on doing the analysis and what we're going to potentially raise from changing a policy or putting something in play.
This is in perpetuity, though. This will, for years to come, we'll have a template in place where we can actually adjust the fees to the actual cost. So the direct cost is what it is, and we'll be able to recoup that direct cost, whatever that is. As that cost increases, we'll be able to. Is that not correct? So
That's what
in
John said
perpetuity.
in answer to your earlier question.
Yeah, so we're kind of setting in motion something that will help recover those costs, so we don't go 10 years without adjusting a certain one fee. I don't think that we want to go through and adjust 1 or 2 fees at a time or 8 fees at a time. I think that we should have a mechanism in place where the fees get adjusted with time. As the cost goes up, then the fee should reflect that. And I think that was the idea, was to put a template in place that would reflect the cost, our actual costs, so that we can pay for the things that we're doing. So.
And part of the reason for the sample that Wayne, I gather, part of the reason for the sample that Wayne has suggested is that this would allow us to see the template as essentially omnibus. It can be applied anywhere.
Can be
It can be applied.
widely applied, or
And citywide would be doing the same thing. So we don't have one department doing it one way and another department doing it the other way. Citywide, it would be the same method.
Our policy would be to adopt the template as part of our budget oversight.
The sampling approach seems like a very reasonable next step to me to get more data.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask Kim, if you don't mind, to be thinking about the motion to be made in the council.
Okay.
I'll turn to you first.
Okay. I appreciate that. Time to read through it.
thanks for your consideration.
Thank you very much. Mr. Harvey, an update on the process for establishing the council priorities for the 2015 calendar year.
Can you just take one of those?
Sure.
Thank you, Chair. So the document that's coming around is a result of the activity that we did last week, in our last council work session. I assigned a point system so to determine what the highest priority items were. A 1 got a 5, a 2 got a 4, a 3 got a 3, and so forth. And so on here I have them ranked with the points in bold, and then how many votes each of them got, a 1 or a 2, or 1 through 5. So this is the template we have. As a staff, we can go ahead and we can take this and we see our higher priority items and work on those first and go down the list. It was suggested by Mr. Taylor in an earlier meeting that you just take on 3 to 5 and say these are our priorities for this year. So if that is the approach you would like, we can take the top 3 to 5. There are 3 that are tied for 5th place. And do that, or you can just accept this document and we can just go off of here and go from top to bottom. So that's all I have. I'll open that up for discussion.
There would be appropriate for you to talk about the priorities you have identified.
And if I just may interject, sorry, I didn't say this earlier, but this is, you'll see there's only 6 of each number. Mr. Hales has not responded yet, so this is everyone except Mr.
Yes, I don't know how I could take your next hour. Do you want just a quick summary?
What I'm particularly interested in is the extent to which these map onto those that you. I understand now that you've spoken to each member of the municipal council about your priorities for the current year, and what it would take to somehow bring the two together.
Based upon the rankings, I would say that they're not. Sorry, I'm going to give you a double negative. Uncomplimentary, but they also are not. They don't mesh up. So based on that, I might suggest an administrative initiative list and a council initiative list, and look for overlap where we support each other and mutual support on each other's priorities. But you'd have to get clear down to the best place to raise a family before May and I started clicking in on your list.
Let's talk for a minute about the wisdom of trying to do that.
Just one observation that the Salt Lake model that I initially proposed, they do have 2 lists, and they do limit to 3. I think the purpose of that, again, is focus. Not that other things would come up or other things would be discussed throughout the year, but at the end of the year, what we make measurable progress on. And they did have 2 lists.
The council had 2 lists, or the city has 2 lists?
Yeah, the city had
its own list.
Council list and a administrative list. And so as part of the purpose for us as staff is also an idea of, okay, how can we best allocate our resources, that we're spending our time on things that are highest interest to the collective whole of the council. So, I mean, there's value in having the whole list. There's also value, I think, in saying, yeah, we want to see measurable progress on these 3 things, if nothing else. So it all depends on what approach you want to take, but that's just my possible.
My sense is that if these, once these are unpacked, there's a lot more potential for linkage for more specific priorities. And it would be profitable to line the 2 up and see how many connections we could ultimately draw.
Right, and I think it would be good to express mutual support for each other's lists. If there's, and I found some areas where there wasn't strong support to know that up front, and maybe that's probably changed my agenda a little bit, and there may be some of that vice versa here. And
I see the merit of that, trying to somehow extract the maximum complementarity from the two lists. That's essentially constituting an agenda. Start on top and work on the agenda as the year goes on.
Yeah, one other brief comment is that I don't think there's any rush to get this done by today. That was one purpose in starting October.
Right.
I think it is helpful if we wrap it up in January.
Yeah.
But if we wanted to task us with taking a few minutes to basically categorize the mayor's list into these different topics and see where that overlap is, that's something I think we'd be happy to help the system.
I think a great goal would be State of the City address, and sometime we haven't set a date, but I think it'd be a really fabulous thing for both of us to kind of express our priorities at that opportunity.
Second meeting in January, first meeting in February.
Sure. I mean, we're under no constraint. Is there a specific date on State of the City? I know we have to come and report, but yeah.
Different ways. I think they did a movie last time.
But we have a movie planned.
As I look at the list here, I see number 13 tied for last. And yet, I wonder where we are really with that. You know, I'm not sure that doesn't fit in with the number one priority that we've got. So I get some confusion.
And that's one of the things. The number one priority is very broad. We talked about this last meeting.
We did talk about this, and I remember
you know, we as a council staff, because that's the number one thing, you know, we're going to come back and say, well, these are the things that you have to do for a structurally balanced budget, and RAP tax will probably.
So if it falls back, then it might fall back up to the top.
Yes, it would probably capture other items on the list and make the list shorter.
I think, for instance, you know, I'm pretty sure RAP tax was on the mayor's list, if I remember right. And
That's
so as
number
we categorize some of the mayors, it may be worthwhile to categorize some of these lower ones and consolidate the list.
Shall we look forward to that at our next meeting?
If you'd like to move forward in that way.
I think there's good wisdom in having two lists. I mean, I think we have different responsibilities a little bit. So I think our lists, and we try to bring those lists together in various ways. We're trying to combine to one list. I support the two lists.
Looking forward to that. Thank you.
Let's
Next, discussion of residential placeholder zones.
Just a very brief introduction. This was an item sponsored by Councilmember Sewell and Santiago, I believe. No, Winterton and Santiago. There you go. Yeah, three of them. And this is a follow-up probably from our last discussion about pre-zoning and some of the issues that we've specifically been dealing with as of late. One specific issue on the west side sort of prompted that discussion. So with that, I would turn the time over to Mr. Sewell.
Okay, so we occasionally encounter parcels that are known to be desired for residential development. They may be adjacent to existing residential developments. They may be surrounded by existing residential developments and have no farm usage at the current time. But many of these are still zoned with the RA zone, residential agricultural, which allows for all kinds of a lot of different kinds of farm animals, and we've seen some of the problems that can result from that. So the question that we wanted to raise was, should we look at having a few additional zones available to us in our toolkit for some of these kind of situations moving forward, not trying to change existing usages, but looking ahead. So the three specific questions we had were, one is, if we want to use a low density residential zone to kind of signal that an area is intended for residential development, is the existing R120 zone, which I think is the lowest density we have available, is that adequate, or should we consider creating an even lower density zone for that purpose? We're also wondering if we should have essentially a lower intensity residential agricultural zone that would allow some agricultural uses, but not farm animals. So that's another potential zone. And then Mr. Winterton and I have encountered a situation where it might be useful to have a zone that was residential agricultural, but allowed only for grazing animals. There's a case where a property owner actually wants to revert back from a residential zone to a residential agricultural zone, but does not want, nor do the neighbors want, to have general purpose farm animal capability in the area. So those were the three potential new zones we were looking at, and basically we're just wondering how the council felt about it, if it would be amenable to asking staff to looking into potentially creating those options for us, or if they felt that they would be useful.
Ask the mayor if there's any inclination on the administration's part to take a look at the agricultural properties, current properties, in the eye of potential conservation.
So Gary, here's Gary and Bill. I think the answer is yes. The question is, and this is where I turn to Gary and Bill, is how much resources they want to put, they have to put towards it, and the council to the question is what kind of product could they deliver that would be the most helpful to the council in making that decision.
If I may throw out one observation for Gary, because the question will be, I think it's a very salient question as resources often comes up. I know what Gary's going to say. He's going to say, well, what do you want us to take off to do this instead?
What would you like us to take off?
Yeah. What neighborhood plan don't you want done?
So I'm not going to ask Gary the question that way.
Certainly, council staff come up with a few preliminary research type options, but ultimately that would still go and be funneled to community development for the review. It might take a little burden off them, but and then go through the planning commission. Another approach might be that rather than proactively, hey, let's address a single issue, that we just add it to the list of things to be considered in the neighborhood planning process, and that necessarily wouldn't be a new initiative that they have taken on, just be additional consideration as they went through in their planning processes. Maybe a more administratively easier thing to take.
One thing that we're going to be doing in the new year is it's time for our 5-year general plan update and to start that process. Now, the general plan doesn't get as specific as the neighborhood planning that we're doing into great detail. But that is one area in which this type of an issue can be addressed. There's always this tension in the city over zoning, and do we pre-zone areas and determine what can happen there, put the zoning in place and let it go forward and happen, or development happen now because it's pre-zoned, they have a right to go forward, and there's no more council review of it. It's an administrative review, and our answer to a developer will be, does it comply with code? And if it does, we'll approve it, whether we think it's the best development we've ever seen or if we think it's the worst development that we've ever seen. So there's always that tension of how much do we, in essence, pre-zone property for what people want to do. And one of the things that I would like to see is maybe not necessarily pre-zoning property, though that can make sense in a lot of circumstances. We do that in almost all of our commercial areas. If we know it's going to be commercial, it's pre-zoned commercial so that people can go forward. What we really haven't done a good job with, I think, as a city in the past, is effectively using our general plan. If you pull out our current map of the general plan and look at it, you'll see large areas that are probably zoned agriculture that almost all of us would agree are really going to be residential in the future. And that causes particular problems for us, especially with long-term transportation planning and things like that. As MAG and UDOT will come in, they'll look at our general plan and say, oh, well, we don't need to worry about Geneva Road because you have this whole area out here that's going to be agriculture for the next 20 years. And we know that's not really accurate. And so what I would, one way of addressing it might be as we come in the general plan in this next year, which, by the way, doing the general plan and the parking plan that we're working on now, that's going to slow down some of the specific neighborhood plans that we're working on. But using the general plan more as a guiding document of where we really think future development is going to go, and not as a control document in the sense that now people have to jump through a hurdle to come in and get a general plan change and then a zone change. But use the general plan as a planning document saying, yes, we really do want this area to be residential, then go ahead and leave it the zone that it is. But it's more of a timing and sequencing issue that's now in the general plan. And that might be, depending on the direction council's wanting to go on this, that might be a way to handle this issue, is by really setting out in the general plan, at least right now today, where we intend to go in the future. And then when somebody comes in for a rezone, then it gives you one last chance before the trigger's pulled on the zoning to say, okay, have conditions changed in between the times that we've done our general plan updates that we've changed our mind, because things can move quickly, as we've seen.
Do you see any potential assistance being brought to the revision of the general plan were the council to appoint its own committee to study these agricultural zoning matters?
No, and actually that'd be very helpful if the council had an idea of really where they wanted to go. Right now, my feeling is that it seems there's this issue, how do we deal with it, what should we do with it? And if the council defines that a little more and says, yes, of all the areas we can go, we really want to go this direction, then I think we could be very effective in assisting the council to get where they want to go.
I actually view that as preferable myself as well.
I wonder if the three of you who sponsored the item on the agenda think through that prospect and have a recommendation for our next meeting.
Any questions? So the approach that you're proposing with using the general plan to sort of signal, would that offer any protection against some of the problems that we've seen with, for example, farm animals in residential areas that we know are intended to develop residentially?
Well, and that's part of the problem and the trade-off is at least right now the ordinance as it exists allows farm animals in agricultural areas. And when you look at the general plan, it may signal that, yes, this area is going to be residential someday, but the zoning right now, the rules on the ground right now today allow agricultural animals. I think maybe one of the high-level policy discussions, and especially with some of the conversations about and concerns that some in the community have about farmland going away and those areas, is if we can really get our arms around what areas of the city we want to preserve as open space or long-term, and pursuing those with, somehow conservation easements or transfer of development rights, things like programs like that, so that those can be preserved, might be the better way to go. What happens is agricultural land stays agricultural land. We think it's going to turn residential in the next 30 years. It probably will and has been the majority of it over time. But we leave it agriculture with all of the rules in place for a truly agricultural area, but it's really not. It's a place in transition. And
But that could be addressed.
but that could be addressed, exactly.
So those potentially new zones would, I think, personally think would be very appropriate matter for such a committee. So,
And then in those areas where, as a policy body, the council's convinced and puts in place, we truly want this area to be agriculture. It's a full-blown agricultural zone. And in other areas where it's kind of a whole, it's hasn't developed yet, but we anticipate over the next 20 years and over the next 10 years, we would like it to develop. It might be a different kind of agricultural zone with a lot less agricultural uses and things going into it. Because right now it's kind of an all or nothing. It's either our R1 zones are either kind of suburbia or agricultural zones, big, robust agriculture, and we have no in between, if that makes sense.
I'd love to see some in between.
Those of us that have been down to visit the House and K's area.
yeah.
There's a concern, I think, there's a number of concerns. Most of what we're talking about right now is all going to happen south and west. I mean, they're just not other large areas. And there's a conflict down there. There are the old farmers, there's the people that live there. They moved to the west side of the freeway and down by the lake to get away from the city. And now there are a number of big developments with, Celebration or Ivory Homes coming, and then down south that other project proposed. And so there's some real conflicts going on. I don't know how to. Yeah, so new approaches are welcome. Just come up with something different than what we have.
And on the west side, on the southwest area, over several neighborhoods, we are working right now on a specific neighborhood plan in that area. So it runs from about, Center Street south.
Is the developer involved in that, or is that separate from? That's not.
Several developers have been involved with that, and there's some proposals of some large developments out there. So in about almost one half of the west side, we are going through a neighborhood plan right now to deal with that. And I think you're right. That's really the most viable area to have that conflict is west of the freeway.
And then as we have the discussions about preserving open space, again, that throws it right back to those same property owners, and how do we give them their opportunities that they ought to have, and still have the city that we're trying to get. There's some conflicts there.
So with form-based codes, they have the high density that works its way down to lesser density. Is there anything with agriculture? Is there any sort of like a green belt buffer or a park, or is there a way that we could use that same concept to anytime there's residential to have some sort of a green space buffer or some sort of, I don't know, some sort of, decrease, you know what I mean? I don't know, really a decrease in density, but just some sort of a buffer where it's a natural buffer from, and I don't know how we do that, if it's all owned by people that probably don't necessarily want to have their land to be a park, but if there's some way to buffer between
And we would be more than happy to sit down with the committee and brainstorm ideas or procedures on how to get there. But
Our staff make sure that happens. Thank you very much.
Just a little footnote. I mean, because I know we're trying to do something, I mean, part of this discussion was spurred on because of the pigs right next door. And the mayor and I were down knocking doors, I don't know, a week or two ago. And one of the ladies, there's a development in New LDS Church going in right across the street. And it was like, oh, we're going to miss the pasture and the horses that were there now, you know. So
Yeah.
it's very specific to each animal.
And, at our policy lunch on Monday, there were several, oh, I love the smell of farm
And manure.
and manure even, yeah. So you do, it's, I don't know.
That's a wonderful
If it's
world.
possible.
How do you be everything for everyone?
Oh, right.
Let us break until 2:30, when we will recommence with the matter from that one. Yes, Matt has suggested, I beg your pardon, that we invite Mr. Whitmore to provide a report of the benefits of surplus bicycles for the Provo Bicycle Collective, and then we will take a break.
Sorry to postpone the break.
Mr. Whitmore, would you just proceed by telling a little bit about yourself? I'm not sure if every councilman is familiar with who you are in your organization.
Yeah, so you want me to start from the beginning, where I started with the city, or where we're at now, or
where everything's appropriate for this?
Okay, perfect. So for this discussion, where we're specifically talking about the Provo Bicycle Collective, the Provo Bicycle Collective is a nonprofit, 501(c), so it's all legal nonprofit. We operate here in Provo, obviously, and we provide service to the community through fixing up and selling used bikes that are donated. And we also provide a shop space where people can come in and work on their bicycles. So it's, instead of handing your bike to the magician at the bike shop, you can come in and learn the magic. And then we also have a plethora of parts as well that we take off of bikes that are unsafe, or parts that are just donated off of bikes already. And you can come in and get parts for your bicycle that way as well. We have everybody from members of the homeless community all the way up to Cat 1 racers, so like Lance Armstrong type guys that'll come in and use our stuff, because we do have a full service shop. The way that it works is it's 100% volunteer run. So the way we pay the bills is by selling bikes. That's about the only way. That's why I have to grow the scarf in the wintertime, because we can't even turn the heat on. So we stay warm, we cuddle up and work on bikes that way. All the bikes are sold at a very low price. I don't think we've ever sold a bike for more than $150 at the shop to make them available to the community at all levels. We do programs with schools. We've worked with Independence High School a couple of times in the last few years, doing an Earn a Bike program. So we would go in and we would bring broken bikes, have the kids run through the bikes for a 2-week course, and at the end of the course they get the bikes for free. And then we've also donated bikes to other, we've donated bikes to some children organizations, a couple high schools, and then again, people in the homeless community that we help out from time to time. Yeah, and the way the shop operates is you come in, it's a $5 minimum donation to use the shop per hour, and then we just have volunteers there that can walk you through everything, how to work it, how to fix it, and what to replace. So that's kind of the rough and tumble of how it works.
I've personally been involved with the collective, and they've taught me a few things and taught me to try fixing my own bike.
Yeah.
I don't have quite the patience that they do.
Yeah. And the idea is in that engagement, right? Because the bicycle, we see it as a way to be engaged, not only in sport, but engaged in your community and the things around you. You're moving a little bit slower, you see things a little bit more. You're able to stop and say hi, those types of things. And so we figure if we take that engagement and we also put it into the machine itself, it makes people more self-reliant, and it makes them able to enjoy their bikes more. We have a lot of people who come to BYU and they've served LDS missions, and a lot of them say they hate bikes because they were stuck on a Walmart bike the whole time. And at the shop, and I've worked professionally in bike shops on and off for about 15 years. At the shop, we call those BSOs. They're bicycle-shaped objects. So we're trying to train people. You know, the only mission statement we have is to put Walmart out of business selling bikes. So get people on bikes they enjoy, so that they can get out and enjoy our beautiful city. So that's the idea.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Where is your shop?
We're off of 49 North and 1100 West, so just down the street. So you know the old Hostess factory? I think it's like Brand's Bakery, where it looks like storage units, but it's actually a couple industrial places right there.
And I heard you say that your main thing is to help people be able to fix their own bikes.
Yeah.
If somebody doesn't want to learn, do they drop it off and you guys fix it?
No, we don't do that. We've done that from time to time in special circumstances, but generally don't, because we have a great working relationship with our local bike shops, and we don't want them to feel like we're taking away from any of their business. So, yeah. We don't sell new parts either. If somebody needs something that's new that we happen to not have used, or they want something a little bit nicer, higher end, we'll send them to any of our local shops here.
I try dropping them out.
They would.
Yeah.
How many graduates do you have of your, is it Earn a Bike program where the kids come in, they get to fix the bike and then take it?
Yeah, so
how many have you had
right now we're sitting about 22 kids. There was a change of principalship recently over at Independence, and that was the school we were working through primarily. And we're hoping to expand that program again in the spring. It was a summertime program though, Brad. So we've been open about 3 years now. And so, yeah, the last 2 years we've done that program with them. So, yeah, it's been good.
One more question, but you do sales that might partially compete with some of the bicycle stuff, but that's not a conflict. You don't.
Yeah, no, not a conflict. And again, we're selling bikes that are, it's a whole different experience, right? And I've personally worked with all the shops with other community stuff I've done. I used to run Mad Dog Cycles for a little while. So again, great relationships with all of our bike shops. We send people there. We'll say, tell the collective you sent you. A lot of times they'll give people discounts if the bike collective sent them. So we're really happy with that. Because if you're looking for a brand new bike, the bike collective's not the place to go.
So are there any other bike collective type nonprofits in Provo, or are you the only one?
There was one that cropped up over in the Joaquin neighborhood, and we tried to get a hold of them and talk with them because there was some conflict, and they were using some of their resources to provide services in some other country, and it was hard to find out exactly what they were doing. And we were a little concerned about that, obviously because Provo's a pretty small place to support a shop like that. Like I said, we're full volunteer based. When we first opened, the first year pretty much came out of my pocket, not other volunteers' pockets. And then we probably my hours have cut down a little bit trying to finish up some of the projects I'm working on, but when we first started, I had probably about 35 hours in the shop a week for free. And so we were a little concerned that all that hard work might be undermined, and we tried to get a hold of them. We never could. Turned out they lived in Salt Lake. It was a weird deal, and they've kind of went away. We haven't heard anything from them. So, but for a minute there was, yeah. But we're the only ones currently. Yeah. So.
You now have a new stream of supply.
Correct.
Do you have any arrangement with Deseret Industries or other agencies in the community?
Yeah, so
where these might be dropped off, not knowing about the bicycle collective.
Yeah, for sure. So we've contacted DI before, and their policy is it's just legally the way that the operation works, because they throw away a lot of bikes, a lot of stuff that we could fix easily. But just legally the way their policy works, if they were to turn the bikes over, there's a lot of legal stuff in us taking the bikes. If somebody gets injured, they could get sued, so they're concerned about that. We've talked with BYU before in the past, and their main concern is they had a program where they would sell a lot of the bikes that they got rounded up on campus, and I think they still do that with some of them. But with a lot of them, I think they recycle them because what they were finding is every year the same bike was getting abandoned on campus, and so they're also worried about that. So currently, it's the community and then the program which the council passed, where we're able to get bikes from the city as well. So those are our two main streams as the community. So Eagle Scouts. So if you guys know any Eagle Scouts, great Eagle project, and the local council loves that. They'll pass it off as Eagle project. So. Yeah, but specifically on the note of those bikes, I think that's why I was invited to give you guys a little bit of an update on that. I believe we've gotten two shipments so far from the police, right around 97 bikes, I believe, was the total. About 48 of them have made it back into the community as full bikes. A couple of them were deemed unsafe. They were these BSOs. And so we stripped them down, we recycled the frames, but all the parts were put into our parts bins, and then I'm sure some of them have ended up on bikes, but who knows? They're big part bins. And it's actually kind of put us in a great position that we've wanted to be in for a while, where we're actually looking for a bigger location. We've outgrown our current location in big part to that new stream of bicycles that we're getting. And so this winter, the physical shop might actually close down for a month or two, so that we can do that transition to a new location. So we're looking for something we can afford. That's the trick. So yeah.
If I might, just to bring this to your attention in case you have questions while he's here. So what we have done in the past is we passed 2 individual resolutions that allowed the police department to give a specific set of bikes that were attached to the resolution to the bike collective. On the agenda for tonight is a resolution that just gives the police department ongoing authorization to turn bikes directly over to the bike collective and just give you a yearly report about what they did. So,
thank you. This is a praiseworthy concept.
Yeah, thank you.
More power to you.
Yeah, we enjoy it, and we I think a lot of people in the community respond well, so it's a good thing.
Did you bike here today?
Yeah. Yeah, I just commuting.
He's wearing a scarf.
Yeah, I got the scarf on. Just commuting, I probably do about 35, 40 miles a day. Just, running errands and doing this. Really enjoyable. So, any other questions or anything else? All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Let's resume in 5 minutes at 22, please.
So, Ryan, do you have a digital copy testing, and some different things that would consider that club fighting. So he looked into that. So there is state code already for this, and his sense is that people are just either not aware that it's a law, or just, you know, not obeying the law. And
What did he find in terms of the effort to determine the incidents?
The incidents. He said there were 11 documented incidents of this type of fighting.
In 2014?
I believe it was in 2014. I'll have to, I believe it was this year. I'm sorry, hold on. According to law enforcement, criminal records data said there have been 16 cases over the past 7 years throughout the state. I'm not sure where I remember 11 from. So over the past 7 years, there have been 16 cases. He said that he's not sure if it's going undocumented. There are times when, obviously, when maybe the police come, but they don't press charges, they don't do anything about it, so they just come and go. So it's harder to document how many times it's actually occurring, but these are the times that have been documented over the past 7 years. So my own preference would be to pass a resolution on this so that we can get the word out. I know that there have been incidences in our own community, and I would like to get this information out to as many as possible. It is a law. They can be charged if they're holding these, you know, if parents are posting these at their home, they can be charged with Class B misdemeanor for having it in Provo, Class A misdemeanor if they go by the state statute. So it would be good to educate people so that they know this is illegal. He said, Mr. Sampey also said that there are teens that are vaping that don't know it's illegal. With the e-cigarettes, and there are things that people just don't know. They don't know that it's illegal. I think many of these youth think it's a sporting activity. So my focus would be or hope would be that we could just raise awareness, educate, maybe even do some sort of a joint effort with the school district. I don't know if they would be willing to join us in a resolution of some sort.
Let me ask these two gentlemen, if you're aware of any precedent for a municipal council adopting a resolution endorsing a particular state statute?
Not in my memory for this council. I'd have to look it up.
There's nothing to prevent us from doing it. I'm just wondering if you're aware of the precedent.
Not locally.
Is the intent, though, really simply an endorsement of the state statute, or is it a public statement of the council's disapproval of an act?
Or the awareness of the issue. That was my understanding of the intent of this resolution.
You're right. It's not mere endorsement, though it does constitute that.
Right.
But rather a consciousness raising.
Yeah. I don't think that's uncommon.
Is this something you could work with our staff in concert with the school district to forward and perhaps prepare a resolution?
I think what I'd be looking for is, I think most of the resolution we would draw from this document that Kim's already prepared or have assistance in preparing. You could formalize that to resolution fairly easily. What I think I'd be looking for is, would the council support that being on the next upcoming agenda? And a motion would be helpful.
Thank you.
I am in support of that, but I was also wondering, to me, if we'd have even greater support. A lot of these are set up at the schools, and I would just as soon have the school board. Have we done a joint resolution with the school board before?
I don't think we've done a joint resolution. We could certainly inquire if they'd be interested in that. My original thought was maybe this resolution would just encourage other organizations, even beyond the school board, to consider adopting a similar resolution, and then it'd be up to them. And then at your next school board meeting, you could certainly say, hey, we're encouraging you and others to promote awareness of this issue.
I'd like a motion to place the proposed resolution on the meeting.
I'm glad to make that that motion. I would also like to, again, I would like to at least make contact with the school board as part of that resolution, as part of that motion.
Second, the amended motion. Second, all in favor. Motion passes unanimously. Mr. David is executed. Mr. Gary, the discussion of the council and County Governance Committee recommendation regarding ordinance amending Provo City Code Section 2.70.1010, conflict of interest disclosure.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll see if I can help get us back on schedule here. We've discussed this a couple of times here before, and it is on the agenda tonight to pass it as amended as part of our code. So when we met last, we talked about some of the content of this, the conflict of interest disclosure. You see there the current part of the code is just just one sentence, 5 lines long. And as our committee, Mr. Sewell and I, with help from staff, including Brian Jones, looked at this and compared the ordinance with what other cities are doing and what might be recommended by the state. There were 4 issues that really surfaced. One is, as we looked at other ordinances, who should this apply to? Just the council or to administration or others as well? Secondly, what should be required as we disclose conflicts of interest? Anything from discussion or deliberation up to and including leaving the room during the discussion. Thirdly, how would we define family? Many ordinances included not only council members but family or relatives as well. And thirdly, I'm looking at the penalties. So briefly to each of those, the proposed ordinance, as you see on line 40, includes just is intended to apply only to council members. And then you'll see on lines 44 and 45, the proposal that it extend to discussing, deliberating, deciding, and voting, not just voting. And for the purposes of this resolution or this amendment, we also, as you see in line 60, subsection 4, starting at line 69, relative is defined by 5 generations. So you, your parent or grandparent, your child or grandchild. That's how we decided to define relative. And then lastly, we decided to make any penalty really would be subject to whatever is in place at the state level, the state code. So that's how penalties would apply. Maybe Brian can speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that there were some changes made to this just yesterday after getting some additional feedback from Mr. Miller and speaking with Mr. Sewell. They're fairly insignificant, but so, for example, in paragraph 4, I added the word sibling to the definition of relative because I think that was always intended and had just been left out on accident. And in 3C, Mr. Miller pointed out correctly that the word which should be that, and the grammar of 3B was a little bit awkward, so I revised that paragraph a little bit to read better. So those are the changes that you don't see here, but we'll get you the printed copy of those this evening so you can see the updated. But I don't know if I answered your question. I just had that on my mind.
Right, well, thank you. Just relative to the penalty, what we talked about to this.
So by way of context, and I mentioned this to Mr. Sewell yesterday and to Mr. Garrett today, keep in mind that there is no penalty under the current ordinance. So the current ordinance requires recusal whenever disclosure is required under state law, but provides no penalty for failing to do so. So this proposed version matches that in that there's no additional penalty or specific penalty for violating this section. So the penalties that would apply would be if part of the act of violating this section also violated state law, either because you had a conflict of interest under state law and you failed to disclose it, or you did one of the prohibited acts under state law by accepting a bribe, basically, or something else, then the state law penalties would apply to that part of the violation. But there's no specific penalty for merely failing to recuse yourself, other than, as I pointed out to Mr. Sewell and Mr. Garrett, under kind of, even though it's not spelled out in the ordinance, under general principles of rules of order, if you were to violate the rule, or if someone became aware that it appeared you were going to violate the rule, then the council, I believe, has it within their power to make a motion ordering you to recuse yourself, or to make a motion censuring you for failing to recuse yourself. So those are the penalties that kind of exist by default without having anything spelled out in the ordinance.
Thanks, Mr. Jones. Dave, anything to add based on our discussions? Okay.
Just one question on the penalty issue. We kind of went back and forth on that a little bit in our discussions. And I think I understand better now why that was put in there originally. So without wanting to muddy the water, I just thought it might be worth kind of throwing that question out there: is should we have a penalty for a council member that deliberately decides not to recuse themselves?
Aside from the two that Mr. Jones just mentioned.
Yeah, the state penalty would still apply if there was something amiss with regard to that statute, but the state statute doesn't require recusal. So I guess the main question is, should there be a penalty specifically for not recusing when you're required to?
And just by way of reminder, I think I mentioned this last time, most of the other city ordinances that we looked at were not merely recusal ordinances. They were comprehensive ethics ordinances that essentially reiterated all of state code about disclosure and conflicts and prohibited acts, etc. And so while most of the ones that we looked at did have a criminal penalty in them, it's at least reasonable to argue that the reason for that was probably because they were comprehensive acts that included those penalties, because those penalties were also part of violating all the other provisions of them, not because those criminal penalties were directed at recusal. So I think it's an open question, kind of new to this council, as to what the right policy is for merely a recusal violation.
I was surprised to see that it had been removed. I thought, well, what I would say to Mr. Jones is, thank you for alerting us to the possibility should we ever wish to move in that direction. But the sort of allowing for the problem to present itself before doing so.
One question, it's on a little different issue than one. I didn't know if there was more discussion with that issue, so I didn't. Mine is probably more of a specific application. On line 45, where it says herself or himself from discussing and deliberating, is that, how wide, is that in the meeting? In the hallway before the meeting? At breakfast with it? For example, say I'm a council member and happen to be involved in negotiation on some property that wants an annexation change. So I recuse myself. But I also would like my my position expressed somehow. So can I have a discussion with another member of the council outside of the meeting so that position can be represented? Under this is that,
My naive interpretation is that this pertains only to public settings.
There's probably a little bit of ambiguity there. Let me walk you through the kind of the history of this provision. Again, we started out with basing this on the template of Orem's, which was also somewhat based on Salt Lake's. And theirs doesn't use the word discussing. It says deliberating. I think it says deliberating, deciding, and or voting. I don't think it includes the word discussing. In the committee, in fact, and if you remember in the original draft, I even took out the word deliberating just to raise the question of whether or not that was something that you wanted to ban or not. Then in committee, and I think in some of our findings that we presented in the last meeting, we looked at a couple of other cities, Boulder, Colorado being one, and I think there was another one that also had a similar provision that specifically said you can't even talk about it outside of the meeting. I think that might have been limited to discussing it with other city employees. I don't remember right off the top of my head, but that's kind of my recollection of how that was phrased. When Bryce sent me the revised draft, or the first suggested revisions for this, it included this word, and that was based on some feedback, as I understand it, received from some of the council members. So it was thrown in there because there was some feedback that it ought to be in there. Frankly, I don't think we have really kind of nailed down or tied down what it means. On its face, it merely says that you, I guess, it does say disclose the conflict, disqualify herself or himself from discussing, deliberating, deciding, and or voting upon the matter, and shall leave the dais. So the context, I think the context of it as it's written is within a public meeting. I don't know that that's spelled out.
Does discussing then, in this context, would disallow someone from leaving the dais and then coming to the podium to speak as a resident or as a citizen, right? The discussing part.
Probably, although that raises a question of whether that's constitutional or not.
Well, I've seen it happen. So
right, and so so then the question is, can we ban that? And so I'm not super concerned about
that's not a constitutional law allows someone to come to the podium.
Right, because then you're affecting their free speech rights in an open public forum, right? So I would probably say, off the top of my head, without having to do so many research, I would not interpret it that way because I think that's probably an unconstitutional interpretation.
That's the reason for leaving the dais.
So you can come to the podium and say it to everybody face to face, right?
How else would you get to the podium?
I think one of the benefits, though, of that is you're clearly acting or speaking in a different role in that. So.
Just to clarify what I think was our intent, at least, and if there are ambiguities, I'm glad that we're discussing them now, but I think our intent was simply to prohibit acting in a public meeting in an official capacity. I don't think we're trying to prevent a council member from speaking as a citizen or in private conversations. Enforceability concerns, First Amendment concerns, things like that.
I would probably, I mean, my suggestion might be, based on the discussion we're having right now, maybe it would be appropriate to just delete the word discussing. I'm not sure that I'm not sure, by what I think we meant by that, I'm not sure it adds anything to the word deliberating. And with the word deliberating already there, I think captures what it is we intended to capture, and discussing is probably superfluous and would fall into some ambiguity, is my thought.
And also clarifying public setting.
Well, and that's why we could add some more language to clarify that, but one of the reasons why I suggest deleting discussing is because I think deliberating, deciding, and voting are all official acts that can only take place in an official context. By implication. Right.
You know, and sorry, since we're getting to language, we may want to consider the word dais. And because it would,
work session.
that dais does not apply in a work session. And I don't think that's the intent. I think the intent is any meeting in which you're deliberating, deciding, etc. And so we want to change dais to, and that might resolve Mr. Miller's, if you change that, just simply say any official council meeting or something. Publicly noticed council.
Do you want to revisit the issue of penalty?
I'm kind of torn on that one. I'm okay with it the way it is, but I think I understand more why it was there in the first draft, so.
Anyone else wish to speak to that issue specifically? So you'll have that ready for presentation, slight adjustments.
Yes.
Revisions. Thank you. Now to gentlemen, welcome. Mr. Decker, Public Works Director, Mr. Follett, the Finance Division Director, Mr. Simon, Public Works and Water Division Director, to lead a discussion of the water and wastewater bonds and an update on the water system modeling and associated storage improvements.
Mr. Miller, I've got a couple of people coming still. I'm wondering if you've got another item you need to go through.
I'm sure we do. No question of that.
Sorry.
The question is, in the absence of Mr. Wright.
Item 10.
Beg your pardon. Yes, we do. In fact, an earlier, Mr. Taylor will lead a discussion on a recommendation from the Planning Commission to the Municipal Council regarding the downtown specific area plan, Central Business District, Franklin, Mazer, Tim, North Park, Dixon, and Joaquin neighborhoods.
There's two components to this discussion, one of which I'll briefly cover. The other component should be led by probably Mr. Caproni and Mr. McGinn. They had some additional items. Purpose for being on this agenda is Community Development has previously sent this document to you for your review in a previous work session. Your Policy Analyst Division has reviewed the document against your other articulated policies as stated in the Vision 2030 General Plan, other master plan documents. And so the purpose of my discussion is a report back on that. Mr. Mumford was involved, but he's felt ill today. As we reviewed the plan, it's 98% or more in compliance with your articulated policies elsewhere. Seems to be supportive of Vision 2030 policies and general plan policies and the visions articulated for downtown there, and certainly takes it to the next level as far as planning and design elements, which will then be further translated into zoning policies and other policies to help implement that. We did sit down with the community development staff and went over a number of issues. Most of them were fairly minor technical issues, which we won't report on. The one major policy issue is in the plan that calls for First North being a major through street connector. That may be interpreted as being inconsistent with other policy statements about walkability, pedestrian connection, and really the need to funnel traffic off of Center Street. Whether that's a good policy decision is to be debated. And so in that light, we could certainly have a more fuller discussion about that First North policy if you'd wish. Other than that, our conclusion is that the policy is supported, whether the council has put line downtown.
This is a matter of our agenda tonight.
And so I would suggest that you turn some time to Mr. Caproni or Mr. McGinn. I know they had several items they wanted to bring up.
Caproni?
Good, unless you got something.
Mister. Okay, never mind, I stand corrected.
Mr. Miller?
Please.
Do we want to bring up a discussion on First North in a regular council meeting, or is this something that we do in a work session that we might need to hassle through a little bit? Are you comfortable with engineering recommendations on First North? Is it something that we need to debate? Sorry, Gary.
You need to debate it. You know, one of the issues, one of the difficult issues with these plans is we haven't quite yet gotten in kind of a good hierarchy of plans. I think we're getting there. And one of the things that I'd like to see eventually is we do a Vision 2030. And then from Vision 2030, we do a general plan. And then from the general plan, we do specific neighborhood plans. And then we do transportation plans and sewer plans and water plans and energy plans. And so everything gets aligned, and we have some sort of cycle where we can get through those. And we're doing this. And so with doing 2030 and neighborhood plans and what we're doing, we're trying to get in and make plans and go forward with it. One of the things that we do have coming up, and I mentioned earlier next year, or earlier today, was that next year we need to start our general plan update because the ordinance requires us to do a periodic update. We need to do that. But I think we also need to, especially in light of a lot of things that have been happening in the community so quickly, BRT, other things like that, we need to do an update of a transportation master plan. And I think that's a more holistic. The discussion of First North is really going to beg a lot of questions about, okay, well, what's the impact on University? What's the impact on Center Street? How does that play in? And how do we balance competing interests like wider regional transportation issues and moving traffic with walkability downtown and all of those things? Those are important policy questions to flesh out. And we obviously feel comfortable with the recommendations that are in the downtown specific plan. But I think that as we go through the general plan update and the transportation master plan update, some things may need to be tweaked, and then we'll come back and keep redoing that until we get to a really, and I don't know in this perfect world or idea I have of how this hierarchy of planning and we can do things. We'll always have things that will have to come in that might seem inconsistent, policies that will come back and really review and go over again. So as far, we'd be more than happy to talk to you about more in depth when you had some more time to get into 100 North and talk about some of the bigger concepts. But I think that 100 North discussion, we would quickly get into it and say, well, okay, but what about all these other larger transportation plan or transportation issues and mobility and moving cars and pedestrians and downtown and walkable community and economic development and all of those things come into play. It's hard to take something in isolation that's so interrelated. So I guess my thinking or recommendation would be, while I agree it's an important issue that council staff has raised, and we do need to get into it and address it, I guess what I would say is go ahead, move the downtown plan forward. I think it's a huge step forward for us of where we are and where we want to go. Do we think it's perfect by any stretch of the imagination? No. And as we do some of these other things, even the retail strategy that's being worked on, I can see coming back and within a year or so tweaking some things. And one of the things that we need to do and get through, I think, is in the next year to 2 years, which will take us a could take us to get through the general plan and the transportation master plan, then coming back and tweaking some of these specific plans to go in line with that kind of hierarchy. So I feel good about going forward, but recognizing that they pointed out a weakness that we fully acknowledge, that because of where we are, we may not have fully thought through it, and it's still an area in flux.
And I very much appreciate and like that. My biggest concern is the perception of the public, and the lack of understanding of that it is a plan that we're working. It's an evolving thing rather than a hard document. Lots of times we present those things, and they use them as weapons rather than actually a tool. They use it as a weapon, and that concerns me. But I guess that's more of an educational process with the public in our neighborhood programs, and saying this is what a general plan actually is. And I guess that's my biggest concern about passing something that we know is not quite perfect, and somebody will grab it and run with something in a wrong direction.
I invite you to consider making a motion in our council meeting and prefacing it with that statement.
Thank you.
If I could just take one more little second, well, it'll be more in a second, but with that is, that's an important issue too. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the community about what a general plan is. A general plan gives us a general direction of where we think we want to go and what we want to do. One of the steps that often the public forgets about, I think even sometimes as a city and city staff we forget about, is we have to take some of those principles that are in those plans and translate them down into actual ordinances that we can put on the books to require, especially with development, that we can require these things to be done to ensure that we're headed in a right direction. And so a general plan by its very nature is general and guides us, but unless and until we take those principles and those plans and put them down into actual law, not just a policy statement of intent of where we want to go, that can create problems and conflicts with the community. I think we need to do a better job of educating people on that issue.
Hear, hear. Now, of course, all this is to be done with no neglect of neighborhood master planning.
I'm sorry, with what?
No neglect of neighborhood master planning.
Absolutely not, but it will be slow.
Thank you very much. Now, gentlemen, the matter of water and wastewater bonds. Update on water system modeling. Are you prepared?
We are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Miller. I appreciate the time to meet with the council and give an update on the water model, water system, and then our intent is to talk a little bit about some finance documents that are on your agenda tonight. There's some bond information on this slide. This back just a little bit here.
Feel free to dim the lights.
I also wanted to express, before I begin, I wanted to express my appreciation to Denise and John and Dan for the time that they have spent, particularly on the finance documents. They've spent quite a bit of time over the last several months preparing us to get to this point, and there's been a lot of updates, a lot of things changing, and we're going to cover some of those. If you remember the last time we spoke about the water system, you might remember we had a little demonstration over here by the window, and we asked a couple of the council members to help us out, and you were gracious enough to help us demonstrate some of the challenges that we have with the water system, and it was really about storage and the issues that we have with storage. Since that time, we have been meeting with the consultant on our water system very consistently and exploring options on trying to solve the storage problems. You may recall the master plan. Jimmy, why don't you go ahead and click to the first slide here. The master plan indicated that we were somewhere between 10 and 13 million gallons short of the recommended storage requirements in the water system. And the master plan kind of just, I don't know that they were very specific in this area, but they basically said you need to get it in the main gallery zone. Those are the 2 tanks that sit up by the MTC. And by the way, just as a reminder, about 70% of our water connections are fed by those 2 tanks in the city. The 11 million gallons that exist there by the MTC, that's a third, or 33% of our storage, our total storage in the city, and yet they service 70% of the water connections. So that gives you a little bit of, even just, you know, a non-engineer is going to say, we've got a little bit of a problem there. In fact, it's a pretty big problem. So we started modeling our options, and this is a model that shows, or an output from the model that shows what we would need to do if we built the additional storage right next to the MTC in the near vicinity or close proximity to the existing water tanks. We would have to do another line on 9th East. We would have to rip up 9th East again, put another water line down 9th East. We would also have to put another water line on 800 North and go down all the way down to Geneva Road. This actually doesn't extend all the way to Geneva Road, but we would have to go clear to Geneva Road. We would have to do some improvements out on Geneva Road, and would also have to put another line on 900 South. That wasn't very appealing to me for a couple of reasons, and so we asked for some additional options. Go to the next one. This one shows if we rebuilt Slate Canyon, what we would still have to do. Slate Canyon is the existing reservoir that I showed in the slide presentation. You may recall the storage, the lid on the tank is in very poor condition. If we rebuilt that, we would still have to build all the water lines that are shown on this slide. So we asked for several other options. Option C is shown here. We started saying, let's try to explore options in getting the storage closer to the areas that really need to be serviced. And this is one that we explored a little bit and started to generate some ideas about dividing the existing water zone. You may recall the existing main and gallery water zone, they feed most of the valley portion of Provo City, basically from about University Avenue all the way to the west. And we talked about splitting the water zone with the consultant, putting one of the water tanks in the Grandview area, and they still said this is how much you would have to improve if you did this. So the next alternative is D. It also splits the water zone and puts the lower tank in Slate Canyon at a lower elevation. And we still have a problem, particularly on 800 North. We have to build quite a bit of a water line. So the final solution, the final option that we asked them to explore is to build 2 water tanks, both serving the west side and splitting our current water zone either at the railroad tracks or at I-15. So we would build two tanks, one in the Grandview area, one in the Slate Canyon, and they would be built at a lower elevation, about 120 feet lower than the MTC tanks. And we would split our current water zone, again, along one of those 2 boundaries. And these are the improvements that, as far as the water lines that would be needed. Now we have, since this slide was made, we have made one additional alternative to the Grandview tank, and instead of coming down all the way to 800 North, we have run it out on 1700 North. Part of the reason that we did that is when I-15 was reconstructed, we put a sleeve underneath I-15. We have a 36-inch sleeve that's just empty right now, and we could slide a 24-inch line, a water line, through that sleeve without having to bore underneath I-15. And so that's why we chose to go down 1700 North. So effectively, we would put tanks, roughly 10 million gallons of storage that would serve the west side of Provo, and the current 11 million gallons that sit next to the MTC, they would serve a much smaller area, only from about University Avenue down to the railroad tracks or down to I-15. And so it would be a much smaller service area. And so this came back as the most cost-effective alternative for us to pursue. Now, one of the other things, go ahead to the next slide, Jimmy. This is on the wastewater side. Why don't you go back to the next, to the previous slide. one of the things that that I need to describe to the council, we have had discussions just in the last week or two with the consultants relative to which tank needed to be done first. We're talking about building 2 different tanks here, and all along Bart and I have kind of been thinking we need to build the Slate Canyon Reservoir first. And in the last week or so, we have started to change that position a little bit, primarily because of the development of the Lions Park well and some of the other wells that we're building. There's a couple of site improvements that have pushed us to reconsider building the Grandview tank first instead of the Slate Canyon tank. Now, even as recent as today, the consultant has come back and said one of the things that you may want to discuss with the council is building the Grandview tank first and then building a portion of the Slate Canyon tank. And the idea is that we would build, where we've identified the Slate Canyon tank, it's actually on the west side of Slate Canyon Drive in the area where a park is going to be developed eventually. And the area kind of forces us to build a rectangular tank instead of the traditional round tank that you see most tanks built out of. And the consultant came back and said, if you build the rectangular tank, you could build half of the tank and then plan to add on the additional half later on. And what they proposed to us just recently is to complete the Grandview tank and half of the Slate Canyon tank and the associated water lines that would be needed for both tanks. Their feeling is that we can build those 2 improvements for about $12 million instead of the $10 million that was originally proposed for the entire Slate Canyon tank. And the original idea was to delay the construction of the Grandview tank for several years into the future, probably 6 years into the future. The concern that I had with that original plan was it would require us to come back for a 3rd bond. If you remember, we had talked with the council about 2 bonds being done. The 2nd bond originally was to plan a redundant line for the 48-inch aqueduct that we spoke about, the main supply, the water line that comes down Provo Canyon. And the 3rd bond would be required for the other tank. The proposal that I think that the consultants have given to us today is probably the best in my perspective. It's probably the best recommendation. It would allow us to leave the existing Slate Canyon tank in place for a time. We would utilize the storage to supplement the new tank in the Slate Canyon area, and they would work in combination together for a period of time. But I'm concerned about the lid, the top of the Slate Canyon tank, eventually getting to the point where that tank would have to be removed. And at that point, the city would have to build the 2nd half of the Slate Canyon reservoir. But as far as the dollar savings, this is the option that provides the least amount of distribution lines, the least amount of impact to the city, because we get the storage closest to the area that it actually serves. And they're relatively short distances to get out to the west side of Provo City. So given that very short, brief discussion about what's happened over the last 6 or 8 months, do you have any questions on those proposed improvements to the water system?
How many years did you say that you would be able to go, you think, before we had to finish the Slate Canyon?
We had originally talked about 6 to 8 years would probably be the maximum life. Bart will tell you that the lid on the existing Slate Canyon tank has already been moved once. We've done several improvements to that tank, and it's not in very good condition. And so the consultant, the structural engineer that's looked at it, he said you might be able to get 6 to 8 years out of it.
Would we be able to save in the meantime sufficiently to pay for the other half without bonding?
That's one of the things that we're going to show you in a spreadsheet, and that is the plan is to try to, instead of doing 3 bonds, we'd like to cut it back to 2 bonds and save enough money so that we can, when need to build the 2nd half of the Slate Canyon tank is there, we're not required to go out for a bond. And we believe that we can make it there.
We own the land on Grandview? We'd have to purchase the land first.
We don't. We've looked at several different sites in the Grandview area. We're pursuing a couple of those sites pretty heavily right now. We haven't made any commitments right now, but it would require additional property to be purchased.
You mentioned that the bond would go from 10 to 12 million. Is that the only change?
That's the only change right now.
And the length of the bond that you're looking at right now is a
20-year bond.
A 20-year bond, and we've committed. We have our increases set up for 5 years.
Right.
And maintaining that into the future for the next 15 to 20 years is how we pay off the bond.
That's correct. And maybe we ought to switch to that instead of going to wastewater. Let's look at the documents. And Jimmy, if you want to.
You want the spreadsheet?
Yeah. Jimmy, do you want to do the spreadsheet? This is probably the easiest graph. You'll probably remember this graph from the budget discussions that we had in the spring with the council. And the blue is the water, and what the additional bond payment would do is to reduce this and this fund balance right here. Our bond payment would increase. The difference between a $10 and a $12 million bond, about $150,000 a year. That's the difference in the payment. And so it eats into our fund balance slightly. It reduces it to about 1.5 million, if I remember right, Jimmy, is what you told me. But it would not impact the proposed rate increases that we've talked with the council about. It would make no changes there.
On to wastewater.
Should we go on to wastewater? Any other questions? Just very quickly on the wastewater.
I do have one more question. So, sorry. So the first year it was going to be $7 increase for the $200,000 home, and the next year would be 14, and the next year would be 21. Correct. So then, how does that translate for the ensuing years if we're paying that off? And
we can show you as far as the total dollar amount. You can see right here in this the combined monthly increases.
On the blue.
Yeah, this line right here, the blue line. We were asked to try to keep those increases around $7 a month. You can see a couple of those years that are a little bit over $7, but that was what the goal was, is to try to keep those combined rates around $7 a month. And you
for
can
the next
see
5 years. Then.
Right.
Oh, okay. And then it
For
would go up after.
For the next 5 years. Now, what would happen? What I'm anticipating would happen after year 5 is I'm not going to tell the council we can stop rate increases, because I don't know enough as far as inflation, construction costs, things like that. I suspect that we're going to be able to back off at that point and do increases that would more closely match inflation rates, probably in the 2 to 3% range, something like that. But I think it would be ill-advised for the council to stop or to have the perception that we could stop doing increases at that point. It's largely that same issue that has led the city into the position that we're in right now, where we're struggling to get infrastructure. We're having to go out and bond because of the lack of increases. And I think if we can keep up with at least the inflation rate, that will probably keep up the operation costs and the CIP costs, and we'll be able to keep up with the demands on the system.
Do you need an ordinance to state that you would keep up with inflation, or is that something you can do without an ordinance from the council?
I don't think we have to do that with a specific ordinance. There was a little bit of a discussion. I don't know if John and Dan will talk a little bit from the financial side. There was a little bit of a discussion about whether we needed to have a stronger commitment about even this 5-year plan for the bonding to help the bonding agency feel a little bit more comfortable about the proposed bond. And again, John and Dan probably have a little bit better information on that side, but I think in the water, particularly, we have a pretty strong case for the bond. I think the bonding agency and the bond council feel very comfortable with the numbers that they're seeing in water. That's probably not quite true in the wastewater. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Any other questions? On the wastewater, the only thing that we really wanted to cover in the wastewater is a list of the projects that the proposed $10 million bond for the wastewater would provide to the city. The ultraviolet disinfection system, it's part of the Headworks project. It's actually the Headworks portion of the improvements to the treatment plant are underway right now. The ultraviolet disinfection is another component of that same project, and we would award that immediately after the bond was approved. There's an improvement to a secondary digester that's listed there. That would also be approved quite quickly. The Duncan Aviation Lift Station, it's out on Center Street on the very far west end of the city. The city has made a commitment for some improvements there relative to Duncan Aviation, and also to some residential housing that's proposed in the area, and that lift station would be also funded, and the forced main would be funded from the proposed bond. Would also do an improvement on Geneva Road. It would come nearly from what's the north on Broadview Shores. It's almost to the boundary of Provo.
1390 north, before we get to where the lift station is there.
So much of Geneva Road would have a new sewer main coming down towards Center Street. And then the one component that we probably don't have a lot of details for the council at this point, we have been about 6 months into a master plan for our treatment plant. As I mentioned during the budget session, it's been about 30 years since the treatment plant had any major upgrades to it. And we're in the master plan process right now to identify projects that need to be done at the treatment plant. And there's probably at least one, maybe up to 3 projects that will be needed immediately on the treatment plant, and that would be the projects that we would also take out of the bond. Any questions on the wastewater?
So the actual deliverables for this bond are not as well identified as those for the water bond. And you mentioned that there was some hesitation on the part of the bond council issuer.
I think John probably is better suited to talk a little bit about those ratios, and we can cover that in a little bit more detail. I don't know if it's John or Dan.
I think Dan will come up.
Dan will cover some of the details relative to the actual bond, the information that you have, and then we can answer the questions on the financial issues that I mentioned. Dan?
So to start with the water bonds, as Dave mentioned, as they continue to refine and look at their plans, they're suggesting that the city consider issuing $12 million of water bonds at this point in time. And when you look at the revenues in the water fund, we believe that they're adequate, and that from a rating agency perspective and an investor perspective, that they will view issuing $12 million as reasonable with respect to the revenues that are coming in on the water bonds. The difference is that what was noticed in the council agenda for the council meeting tonight was that the city would issue $10 million worth of bonds. Now we're recommending $12 million worth of bonds. We spoke with bond counsel today. Haven't had a chance to have a conversation with Brian yet. But bond counsel indicates that if the council is comfortable with it, we can change the amount in that resolution from 10 to 12. And it's primarily, as they described it, a political issue as to whether or not the council is comfortable changing that amount at this point in time. The option, if the council's not comfortable doing that, is to move that forward to the first meeting in January and renotice it at $12 million. In addition to that, what the council's asked to consider tonight is what is known as a parameters resolution. It basically sets all of the limits related to the issuance of the bond, and so for the water bond, the maximum principal amount is $10 million as it's written in the documents as they stand right now. The maximum interest rate is 5%. The maximum term of the bond is 21 years, and the maximum discount that it can be sold for par is 2%. Again, the intent of the parameters resolution is to set all of those parameters high enough that ultimately when we go through the process of selling the bonds in the open market, that everything comes in within those parameters or better from the city's perspective. So if the council approves that parameters resolution, then what happens is we do a public notice which starts a 30-day period of time. It's called a 30-day protest period, where anyone can question what the bonds will be used for, how the funds will be utilized, the terms of the bonds, etc. During that same period of time, we'll work with our financial advisor at Zions Bank to go out and work with the various investors that may be interested in these bonds, make sure they're aware of it, the bonds that they're going to be issued, that they can ask the questions they need to ask to bid in a competitive bid process. And that competitive bid process would take place on January 20th, as the document's written right now. And then the night of the council meeting on January 20th, two things would happen. There would be a public hearing where anyone that had any concerns would be allowed to state their concerns with respect to the bonds. And then the second would be the council would approve the final terms of the bond based on the competitive sale that took place earlier that day. If the council had any concerns at that point in time, they would be in a position to turn it down, and the sale of the bonds would not go through. In addition, there is a provision in the resolution known as a reimbursement resolution. And what the reimbursement resolution does is it allows for any funds that are expended prior to the issuance of the bonds with respect to the projects that have been described. Ultimately, Public Works and the Water Fund and the Wastewater Fund would be able to reimburse themselves for the funds that have been expended on the projects up to that point in time. I've described the water bonds. The wastewater bonds are also $10 million with the same parameters, a maturity date of not more than 21 years, sold at a discount not more than 2% from par, and an interest rate not more than 5%. I'll mention on both these bonds, they're tax-exempt bonds, which gets the city a lower rate, of course, and they are revenue bonds, meaning that the repayment of the bonds comes from revenues, in this case related primarily to the rate increases that were put in place for both water and wastewater. They differentiate themselves from GO bonds in that they don't go to the voters for approval, that the council approved these bonds, and revenues are used to repay the bonds as opposed to property tax assessments. Dave mentioned it a little bit, and I'll just mention again that the revenues and the overall financial strength of the water fund is better than what the wastewater fund is. That said, the wastewater fund, with the current rate increase that's in place, we believe will be adequate to service the debt in the wastewater fund. If any future bond issuances were to be contemplated in the wastewater fund, that would likely need to come with an additional rate increase to cover any future. The water fund's a little better funded, and that would be an analysis at that point in time in terms of what the rate increases need to be. We think both will be well received by the market. I think both will receive reasonably good, not favorable, bond ratings from the rating agencies, Fitch and Standard & Poor's. But again, we have to go through that process before we know exactly where that falls out. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, Dan, help me with the 2% discount. Tell me about that. What is that? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Well, depending on where the market's at the particular day we issue and the competitive bid process, the bonds, you know, if they're sold at par, we would essentially get $1 for every $1 of bond that we sold. But if they're sold at a discount because the market, for some reason, either because of the rate environment or because of the credit quality, they perceive that it's something a little bit less than par on that particular day, then they would be sold at a discount. So we would essentially get 98 cents on the dollar if they were sold at a 2% discount. Historically, in the bonds that we've issued most recently in the city, we've actually sold at a premium. The bonds that were sold with respect to the rec center were sold at a premium where the market came and said, okay, instead of paying you 98 cents on the dollar, we're going to pay you $1.02 on the dollar, because we think the credit quality of Provo City is such, or the underlying tax base in Provo City is such that it's worth paying a premium. So it's just the market's way of essentially adjusting whatever the interest rate is to a premium or discount to reflect the current credit quality and the current interest rate environment.
And when we sell those bonds, are we planning on selling them all at one time, or are we looking to sell them as the projects come more into play?
No, the nature of these bonds is that we would sell them all on January 20th if the council approved it on that day. Okay. And then we actually hold those funds essentially in safekeeping until they're invested in the project. That said, the bond statutes in Utah generally require that we have all of those funds invested in the projects that are described within a 3-year period of time. And I think Dave and Bart have assured us that they would have those funds invested during that period of time. So.
Did you say there was a 5% cap on the increase?
On the interest rate. So what we're saying is that if the interest rate were to come back in a competitive bid process at something higher than 5%, we wouldn't issue. Again, that's market driven. Zions and our financial advisor, municipal advisor, has helped us with that amount. We anticipate that the bonds would be issued at something less than 5%. So it's still a very favorable rate environment. We think we can take advantage of that.
What do you think the approximate market rate is right now for something like that?
Yeah, that's probably a question best for Zions Bank. You know, I wish I knew exactly, because that's pretty valuable information if I could tell you what the rate would be on January 20th. But it'll be somewhere likely between 4% and 5%. But I can't really narrow it down to something more narrow than that. So, John, do you have any?
No.
Yeah.
I agree with your statement.
Yeah.
It's hard to know, but we are in a favorable market.
Are there any trends? Now that you've told us you can't tell us, we're going to keep asking you. Well, let me ask the question. The trend, though, if the council pushes us off a month, are there any trends that you see between year-end interest rates and first-of-the-year interest rates?
No, it's primarily market-driven, and what I'll say is that depending on where a municipality is at year-end, and there's a number of different areas that they look at. One is the interest rate environment. One is the demand for that type of credit in the market. Another is whether or not they're looking to issue bank qualified debt, which generally applies to smaller cities and smaller issuances. It wouldn't apply to us, but if they're trying to fit their issuance into a certain category, particularly bank qualified, they may want to issue before year end, or if they're up against the max for that particular year, they may want to issue the first part of next year. And so it is possible that you can see increased activity right before year end or right at the beginning of the year. And when we spoke with Zions about that, they recommended that we not try to push this issuance into, essentially the first week of January. I think the first council meeting is January 6th. They recommended that we push it back a little bit into January, meaning January 20th in this case. In terms of the overall rate environment, there has been a fair amount of discussion for almost 6 years now about rates increasing. That said, there have been movements, but on a historical basis, they've been minimal, and we're still in a very, very low rate environment overall, and anticipate we stay there. Now, that said, some people predict that the Fed will increase rates in 2015, but again, we've heard that a number of years now. So.
I think my message would be, bottom line is, in our current rate environment, definitely more comfortable with sooner rather than later.
What's our bond rating?
Well, these will be standalone new credits, and so we are going to 2 rating agencies in San Francisco on the 18th of December to actually get these credits rated. So they'll be new, but overall city's AA plus rating. But again, on the 18th, we'll get standalone ratings for these. And those ratings look at 2 things. They look at the strength of the underlying enterprise funds. They also look at the strength of Provo City overall. So it's a combination of both that they look at, because they know ultimately the city's going to stand behind these, both the water and the wastewater funds, because they're significant services that the city provides.
Thank you very much. Dave, thank you. Art?
I think the one thing that council probably needs to consider is, again, the notices that were published with respect to the water bonds were for $10 million, and legally we're being told that the council has the ability to change that to $12 million tonight if they don't have a concern from, again, as bond counsel described it, a political perspective.
So I have a question for the mayor. Do you, has there been outreach, public outreach on this, on the water rate increase yet? I know we were waiting for the school bond where you were going to.
So the answer has been that there's been no subsequent after the school bond, but I think my feeling is there was enough public dialogue early on that we haven't sensed a need. We certainly can go and do more if you'd like us to do more.
I guess my next question would be, if it is legal to go to 12, is that, what's your recommendation as far as outreach? Are people going to be caught off guard, or will they even notice that it went from 10 to 12? I mean,
my guess is that they won't even notice.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's going to depend on how many people look at tonight's noticed agenda and then look at the bond issuance notice after it's published, and I suppose people that are actually watching the meeting.
Well, I'm giving all the information too as to why we would do that.
That's right, the rationale.
The rationale behind it.
And that it doesn't impact rates.
Yeah,
I think that's what everybody's going to say is, well, tell me how it impacts rates.
Right, and it doesn't. In the short run, in the long run, does it? No.
The variables that could happen down the road could impact them, but as it looks now, this doesn't impact rates.
The rate increases that have already been implemented will cover the debt service with respect to these issuances. Question on the rate increases is what else? What are the needs down the road of the water and the wastewater systems, and will those be funded on a pay-as-you-go basis, or will they be funded through issuance of bonds and projects related there? And that's where there might be future rate increases if that was necessary.
Dan, looking at future bonding possibilities, where do we stand as far as with the rec center? And I guess we paid off the library, but and these new bonds. Are we still in a fairly good financial position where, should we get more money, need more money, we can get it through bonding?
We can. I mean, Provo's still very well rated. There is an actual debt limit that John, I think, or the auditors will talk about that in the next presentation.
It's related to general obligation debt.
Yes. Yeah, general obligation debt. Again, this is revenue debt. This is associated with the revenues related to the funds and to the rates.
And so those don't matter as much with, as long as we have the revenue or the ability to generate that through the rates. Okay.
You kind of try to think about the enterprise funds as you would a business. There's a dedicated revenue stream, a dedicated set of expenditures, and they don't, other than the transfers to the general fund, they really don't impact the general fund. And they don't fall under the statutory bond limit in terms of general obligation bonds. Those are solely related to bonds paid back with property taxes. So we're in good shape either way. But I think this is one of these where we're trying to make kind of a business-related decision as opposed to a community good decision.
The other thing that's significant right now is that for our enterprise funds, other than the storm drain debt, that's the only debt that we really have on our enterprise fund. So our debt right now is really low for, if you look at other comparable cities for the enterprise fund.
So I have a word to whomever makes the motion in our later meeting. Learn just in the last few minutes about further rationale might be mentioned as a prelude to the motion.
Is there a way to?
Makes good sense.
Is there a way to amend that to 12 million before the next meeting, or is that? We just do it in the motion.
In the motion.
Yeah, I think just in the motion. You know, our typical policy has been, what we've stated in the past but not always followed, is to follow a two-step process. We're actually making a motion to amend the resolution, change it into 12, and then a motion to approve the amended resolution.
And one more rationale is that we still have 30 days for anyone that has those concerns to step forward. And I think that's an important issue also, is not only it's not affecting rates, but if you do have a concern, we still have a month to go.
I invite you to consider.
Thank you.
Mr. Winterton, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, I just asked John whether we could invite our bond counsel to actually provide an amended resolution for you prior to the meeting, so you could adopt essentially resolution 1 at 10 million or resolution 2 at 12 million. We'll do that before your general meeting, so we'll have copies of that available for you. So if you do decide to go that direction, you've already got a written document to respond to.
Now to Aaron Hickson, Ed Erickson, auditors of Vance and Bradshaw, Montrose, and Erickson, for an overview of the Provo City Chapter and the single audit report. Thank you. Yeah. I remind our council that part of that acronym is friendly.
Is what?
Friendly.
Well, I can instruct them.
You need the CAFR pulled up for anything?
Yeah, if you need it pulled up.
Maybe, I guess I would ask you what time frame you have on your schedule allocated.
We have a half hour.
Half hour, that's quite a bit. Well, the document you've got is about 130 or 40 pages. We won't go through it page by page. And there's a couple of documents in Aaron's. I met Erickson. I'm the audit partner with the firm. Aaron has been the audit manager on the audit the last few years. And so we appreciate the opportunity to come and visit with you tonight about the audit that's just recently been completed. my understanding is that you have a copy of this document as well in PDF form, I believe. Is that correct? Yeah.
We uploaded it this morning.
This morning, yes.
To your server, or also forwarded it to your email account. However, I think a couple of those bounced back as file sizes being too
And you're gonna
large.
start with the middle one, right? You're gonna start with the report right in?
Yes, yes. And well, and I'll actually have Aaron probably do that. I'm just introducing us, and Aaron will walk through just a few items in the comprehensive annual financial report. Then there's another document that you also have, which is the single audit and Utah State compliance reports. I'll maybe discuss those briefly. Then then there's another letter that was just handed to you just now. We'll discuss that one for just a moment or two. I think again, as we go, we'll just respond to any questions that you may have as we talk about it.
Okay. So the document is 118 pages. Okay. Both of them?
Just one on the left.
It's 118 pages, and we would not bore anyone to death by going through them in that detail. And so we typically cover about 6 or 7 of the pages. You have a comprehensive annual financial report, and commonly known as a CAFR, and it is a comprehensive report for the city, and it's got many parts. And the first part that we'll talk about is our opinion. We issued a clean opinion this year, and you can see that on page 11 at the very bottom under the caption opinions, and it's plural because you have many funds, and we give an opinion on each of the major funds. And you can see in the first line of that, it says, in our opinion, the financial statements referred to above present fairly in all material respects their financial position of the governmental activities, etc., of Provo City. And so there is no higher opinion that we could give as auditors, as independent auditors. And I just wanted to start with that. Outside of this opinion, everything else is prepared by the finance department, and they did a great job. The first major section of a CAFR is entitled Management's Discussion and Analysis, and that begins on page 13. And you'll see this is where we are going to spend the majority of our time. And the reasons why is because it gives great highlights, and it gives a comparison over the prior year in tabular form, as well as narrative form. The other portions of the CAFR only give you the current year information. And so we're just going to focus here on the financial highlights section. The city's net position, or income, if you will, increased $27 million. This is almost, coincidentally, 50-50 from business type activities to your governmental activities, being about 13.3 for governmental and about 13.5 for business type. And then this is at the full accrual or government-wide level. And the financial statements present your activity in the government-wide, and then they also do it by fund. And at the fund level, you'll see here, it increased $1.1 million with the prior year. And that increase is primarily due to the proceeds from bond issuance for cemetery expansion.
That's governmental funds.
Yes, in the
Just
governmental
funds.
Yes. And so I want to then move to a table found on page 16. That is it. Yeah, I don't know how. Can you all see that okay? Or are you just... So Again, as I said earlier, this gives a comparison of both the governmental activities and the business activities for this year and the prior year. Briefly, it shows that entity-wide or city-wide, your assets increased from 665 million to 690 million. The largest portion of that being capital asset related or fixed assets. And then down to your net position, the total net position, as I said earlier, increased $27 million, with most or half of that being in business type and governmental. And then we can move on to the table on page 17.
I would just say, as you move, the liabilities of the city actually went down about $4 million from last year. So as Aaron said, assets went up about 35 million, but liabilities decreased about 4 million. So I think it was pretty positive.
Yeah, that cemetery bond was the only bond that was issued, and then the rest of it was just debt pay down. I want to highlight at the bottom of this schedule real quick. If you'll see here in the total column, in order for it, you won't be able to see the heading, so I'll just kind of point here. This number here, the negative $22 million, it did not appear last year or this year, and this relates to the loss on the sale of telecom infrastructure, and so because of that, it's not really a fair comparison. And so, in order to really look at the situation on a comparative basis, we'll just kind of skip this number. So your change in net position was 19 million, this year being 27.5 million. So I just wanted to point that out, that that was a very unique situation in the sale of the telecom. And at the end of the last discussion, it was discussed a little bit about, I think you raised the question about debt limits. And just so for your information, for government or general obligation bonds, the city has a limit of $141 million. Right now, you have $41 million of general obligation debt. And so you are well below the legal limit of general obligation. And then the enterprise debt, you are relative, because it was discussed, it is a business. You run the water as a business, and it is not very leveraged at all. And so it is in a very good position. Which I hate to, unless there's anything on the face of the financials that anyone has any questions on, or do you want to point out, Ed? I'm going to move to the footnote.
Oh, I don't know, maybe you might be of interest to look at the governmental funds, their balance sheet.
Oh yes, that's right. I skipped one.
That's what about page 20.
Is on page 25.
And I think if the finance staff have any, as we go through this, if there are certain things you think would be of interest or to be pointed out, feel free.
Okay, so governmental standards require us to basically take the funds and put them in two different categories, major funds and non-major funds. And the funds here presented, the first three, are considered your major funds, and then everything else is kind of rolled up into one column called other governmental funds. And you can see combining schedules at the back that we won't discuss in this meeting. Just of note, there is a fund. There's not a major fund this year that was presented last year, and that was your Parks Construction in Progress account or fund. And the reason why it is no longer presented as a major fund is because the activity of constructing the recreation center has wound down, and it is no longer has the activity or the volume to be considered a major fund. And that's all I really wanted to highlight on that one. But I want to bring up, before I forget, about the creation of the financial statements as we see them here. It was quite a laborious process, and I met in person and via teleconference with Denise and John on various occasions to make sure that the financial statements are accurate and were completed in the time frame that they desired. And at the beginning of the audit, I had a little bit of concern that the process of the audit might have been a little bit slowed because they had a turnover of one of their staff positions. But I can tell you it went off without a hitch. Sarah did a great job in doing helping with the process, and we don't have any written findings in any area of the audit this year. And I do believe that that is a testament to the finance department. So, yes.
First in a few years. It is. And frankly, it's more common than not that we do have some type of findings. Some of them are, and most of yours has been quite minor, but it is unusual for a city your size to have no formal findings. It's quite unusual in our experience.
Yes, yes, and I was very pleased. You can tell that John and Denise are very knowledgeable about the whole accounting process and the reporting process for governmental funds and accounting. Because if there was an error, an oversight in reviewing it and helping to compile this report that I may have had, John was quick to point that out, and same with Denise. And that back and forth gives me a lot of comfort that these aren't just compiled statements, that they are analyzed and they are looked at and saying, hey, this isn't what it was presented last year, why? And I do like those discussions, because it makes me feel like, yeah, not having it, we didn't miss a finding that we should bring to your attention. And those are evidences of that. And so if there are no questions on the CAFR or other comments that John or Denise want to make, I will turn the time over to Ed to discuss the federal and state expenditures and reports that we're required to issue.
Would this be available in overhead? Do we know?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, he's got it too. It's called the single audit.
Okay, yeah. So we'll just. Were there any questions on the CAFR document?
Third document.
Third document.
That's a pretty quick overview. Any questions about that document or the financial statements of the city in general? Again, I think as Aaron said, the audit was very positive. I think Provo City's financial condition, I think, is very strong and positive. And you do have just a very small amount of business type debt, just a few million. I mean, for a city of several $100 million to have that low of debt, I think is remarkable, especially on the business side. So as you discuss this new bond issue, as an auditor, even though that's not necessarily our place, but as someone who has an understanding of city finances and government finances, I think it shouldn't. You're very well positioned to assume new debt. That shouldn't be a problem at all, from my standpoint. If no additional questions, and again, if other questions come up, obviously you can talk to finance, or our phone number is on these audit reports. You always get in touch with us if you have any questions, would like to. There's 3 or 4 reports in here. I'll just touch on them briefly. Again, this will be very quick because we have no formal findings to point out. But the first one is our report on internal control over financial reporting and the city's compliance with grants, contracts, etc., and laws. So I will just point out, we do our audit. Sometimes people are there's a little misunderstanding. The purpose of our audit is not necessarily to come in and solely evaluate controls, but we do that. We understand your controls and processes used by the city to the extent needed to help us to gain confidence that the numbers are prepared properly, and to use that as a basis for reliance. So we don't formally audit the controls of the city. We don't express an opinion on the city's controls, but we issue a report where we do state whether we find anything that we consider to be material weaknesses or significant deficiencies in the city's control processes. So it's a little bit of a distinction there. It's more of a negative assurance than a positive assurance. We just tell you, as we've done our evaluation of the city's internal control processes, nothing came to our attention that we view as material weaknesses or significant deficiencies. And that's what this first report says. That's stated on page 2, but we don't.
As I recall, last year's management letter, there was some
There was a deficiency.
There was one in the RDA, I think.
Yeah.
I think so. And we checked on that, and that's been resolved. That's been corrected and improved.
We do believe it was correct. What it was is over the calculation of income when they did the verification for people applying for assistance, and after that, subsequent to that, we let John know all of the files that we looked at, and we met again with RDA to ensure that additional steps have been put into place to ensure that the calculations are reviewed always, and that they are looked at for their merits.
That's just to make sure people that actually receive assistance are eligible to receive a low-income loan. Yeah. So our next report on page 3 through it's a 3-page report. This now relates to federal programs, OMB Circular A133, which deals with federal grants. And I will just tell you in that report, we talk about each major federal program that the city receives federal funding, also the internal control practices and policies the city has in place over federal programs and how they're handled. And again, in that report, we do state that the city does comply with federal requirements. We found no evidence of non-compliance as we tested these major programs. Now, the schedule of federal awards is on pages like 6 through 8 or 9. 6 through 9. I would commend you. The city, I think, does a very good job of obtaining your fair share of federal grants. Your total expenditures, as you'll see on page 9, is $6.1 million. And I think that's in the amount expended column. And I think maybe it's even a page after that, or
yeah, it's one more page.
Next page, yeah. But well, maybe it's another page. Like I say, you have a lot of you have the most federal grants of any city that we deal with. And again, I think it was money that you should receive. There it is. So it's that total on the bottom right. Actually, the contracts, these awards are total $21 million, but a lot of that amount is over a period of time. Of that $21 million you've been awarded, $6.1 million was spent this year on federal programs. The ones that we looked at as major for this year primarily related to Department of Transportation, some grants that you received for your airport improvement. Those were the ones by testing those, we complied with federal single audit requirements, we got adequate coverage in testing primarily those airport grants that were they were about $2.5 million, 2.7 million spent this year. Anyway, so again, we did indicate on page 12 is a summary of the audit findings, a couple pages back from this. And we do summarize that there were no significant deficiencies or material weaknesses. Right here, number 2, no instances of non-compliance. So we expressed unmodified opinion on your federal major federal programs, and there were no audit findings to be reported. Then we indicate what the major program tested, and that your threshold for distinguishing significant program is 300,000.
And then on step 8, it says the city was determined to be a low-risk oddity. Typically, in a year following a finding, we don't really assess that at low. We'll keep it at high or move it to high. And because of the city being so proactive in making sure that happened, that I felt comfortable that we could keep it up low and not have to increase it. What that would mean is we would have to test twice as many grants as we would have otherwise.
This is a rare event then.
It is a rare event, yes.
However, I should mention, we are frequently referred to by our critics as an oddity always. And so just so you know, that's spelled differently. ODDITY.
An oddity to be a low-risk oddity.
And on page 13, we just indicate there are no findings in the current year. We kind of, on the next page, so we say none. The next page, we close the loop on the prior year, put it to bed, and say here we had some improper eligibility issues last year in the home loan program, a particular loan of $20,000, and we just indicated that that it's been corrected now. That we found that the ones we looked at this year, there were no issues. Our last report is on page 15 under the Utah State Compliance Audit Guide. This has been revamped a little bit. Our state auditor, I will tell you, is a fairly active, aggressive individual. He's out there doing a lot of things, mostly good, I guess. I don't know. But so there are different things he has emphasized, or his office has emphasized, that he wants us to look at as we audit cities. These are some of the general areas we look at. Some have changed a little bit from prior years. Then we also list what major funds we receive from the state, which in most cities is B&C road funds. We did indicate on the next page that our opinion is that in the work we did in testing all of those areas, that Provo City did comply with all the compliance requirements, both the general requirements and also your major grant with the state for B&C roads. We also indicate, similar to our other report, they want us to express a report on internal control over compliance that the city, we felt like the internal controls to make sure you complied with city or with state requirements were good. We saw no problems. And then now they've asked us, similar to the federal, the state now asks us on the last page to give a schedule of state awards, state grants. They're mimicking the federal report. That's the page after this. So we received about $3.1 million in state funding, the total of this schedule. And you can see the different departments we get money from the state, about $3.1 million.
So the state is saying that any state grant where you expend more than $100,000 in one fiscal year is considered major, and we need to test it very differently than otherwise. The exception being B&C road funds, that last one, is always a major fund.
Yeah, and as you can see, that it's over 90% of the state money you receive, $2.9 million out of $3.1 million.
And based on historically looking at your funding from the state, it would be highly unusual for you to get one that exceeds $100,000. So
once in a while we see a city where they maybe have a specific road or new road that the state's participating in, corridor connecting cities or something. That's kind of a one-time thing that may be different. Maybe that would be a large one. The last letter, any questions on these reports? Again, pretty clean. The last letter that Aaron just distributed to you, borrow your copy? I didn't bring mine up, sorry.
Not a problem.
This 3 or 4 page letter, these are just some required communications that we have to give to you as the governing body. It spells out 7 or 8 areas. It's frankly somewhat boilerplate language. There's nothing unusual in the letter. The only thing I'd maybe point out that's a little unusual is just in the second page of it. There's a new accounting standard we just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up on. You may or may not have heard of. So it talks about a new accounting pronouncement, GASB 67, financial reporting for pension plans. Governments now, state and local governments will now, starting next year, will pick up their proportionate share of a state's retirement system on unfunded liability. So the state of Utah, I believe, is in the low 80s, about 84% funded its retirement system. It was probably slightly higher than that before some of the financial meltdowns that occurred in 2008, 2009. State took some action, the legislature, to try to repair that hole. And as you know, now we have Tier 1 and Tier 2, try to work towards that. But other states, frankly, are not, and local governments aren't in as good a position, frankly, as Utah. And so GASB felt it was important information that each government show what their share of that unfunded liability is. Because that unfunded liability, frankly, will come from one of 2 places. It will come from either the market earning the money or the government funding it. And so we don't know, as we say here, we don't really know what the effect will be, other than it will be in the millions, your share. It will go on your books as a liability. And so sometimes councils say, well, geez, how do we budget for that? The good news is you don't have to budget for it. You won't write a check for that liability. It's just a liability that will be put on your statements. Your budget process for that will stay the same. You will still write your checks to URS based on the statements they send you on a monthly basis, and you'll fund that as you've always done. But the powers that be feel that you should, in interest of full disclosure, show that liability that is to be funded down the road. Does that make sense? Any questions regarding that?
How do those numbers that we have really no control over affect our ability to bond? And I mean, our rates, our savings account seems to be dropping down and harder and harder to get in.
Well, the good news, bad news, the bad news, like you say, is it will show more debt on your books and every other government's books. The good news is, I think here in Utah, it'll be less debt than a lot of other places will show. I think we'll look a little stronger comparatively now to other municipalities throughout the country. John,
the other thing I would add too is that they will know what it is. I mean,
yeah, they'll understand it.
Yeah, they'll understand.
A lot of these places look at different ratios like EBITDA, and they eliminate certain things that they know don't have any bearing on your ability to repay your debt. And this would be one of them.
So yeah, they'll be very plugged in. They're very aware of these, and frankly, it's somewhat of a it's technical. I think the theory is good. I mean, you and every other city does have the obligation to fund that eventually. It's not a hard liability that you're going to write a check for next year, and so everyone will understand that. Well, thank you. Hopefully we stayed somewhat within our allotted time. Are there any other questions? Again, we appreciate the opportunity to work with your finance and other staff here at the city. We've done this a few years now, and we really have a good experience working here. Really enjoy it.
And I'd say also it's nice to have people that come every year and understands this group. We have a great relationship with them too.
Yeah,
I've seen it work.
that's good to hear.
Thank you.
Yeah, they take good care of your financial reporting. No other questions? We'll step out then.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a shout out to our finance team.
Yes, we did.
Okay.
Let's now move to the presentation of Austin.
Or is it-
That is
I beg your pardon. Dustin Wright. For a request for a text amendment to section 14.18.020, permitted uses standard land use code in the neighborhood shopping center zone to remove the acreage requirement for funeral homes to allow for a lot split at 4780 North University Avenue in River Bottoms neighborhood.
So last year, the city approved the ordinance amendment to the SC1 zone, which is the neighborhood shopping commercial center zone, that allowed for mortuaries and crematoriums to be added as permitted uses to that zone. As part of that approval, there was a requirement that those uses needed to be a minimum of 1.75 acres in size, and that they needed to be adjacent to an arterial street. And kind of the reasoning behind that was to be able to allow the mortuary for a specific parcel. It's up, you guys probably remember it, up on 4800 North University. The city owned the property and sold it to somebody that was currently putting a moratorium there, or a mortuary. And so through that process, it was seen that since it has citywide impact, if other SC1 zones throughout the city would also have potentially have those uses. And so since it was wanted just specifically for this site, those requirements for the acreage and the adjacency to the arterial were recommended and part of the approval. At this time, the same applicant has come back and would like to take that 1.75 acre requirement off and keep the arterial requirement, so that he will be able to split that parcel and have the mortuary on one end and then have a pad site on the other end for a flower shop, which is a permitted use of the zone, but which, due to the location of this property there with University Avenue on one side that doesn't have a lot of access to this property, there's only one access off of Foothill Drive, and with additional uses on the property, there could be a potential issue having too many vehicle trips averaged on a daily basis going to the site, which would require a second access, which probably wouldn't be very feasible for that site. Up here, I've put together kind of a map showing these red lines are the arterial roads in the city. The green outline areas are SC1 zones that are adjacent to them, and then the blue areas are parcels within those zones that are under 1.75 acres. So if this ordinance is changed, those would be parcels where that use would be able to be located. So if we go to the next page, there's zoomed in on some of those. So we can kind of see what the surrounding areas are next to these locations. The SC1 zone in its nature is to be kind of on the edge of residential neighborhoods and to provide daily service type amenities for those residential uses. And so you'll see in a lot of these, if you go to the next one, that they're in close proximity to residential uses. And we could just keep going through those. So one's Center Geneva. It's not. This one's not necessarily a major issue, but the others. The next one, I think, on the south end of the city. This is an area that's just right next to a residential neighborhood. So, are there any questions?
Planning Commission recommends.
The Planning Commission and staff has recommended that this ordinance amendment is denied and not changed in its current.
And primary rationale for that recommendation is the possible unintended effect of similarly zoned properties.
Yeah, the original reason that it was allowed was for that specific site. So by having those restrictions on there for the acreage and the adjacency was basically to allow the door to be open wide enough for it to work on that property, but not to open up wide enough that it could happen in other residential areas that could create some negative effects potentially residents.
So what we're making sure I understand, what has been recommended is to deny that applicant's request for a lot split.
To deny his request to change the ordinance, to strike out the part of the ordinance that says 1.75 acres are required for mortuary. The lot split would be a separate issue. If that changed, then that would be his next step, would be to split his parcel to sell it to somebody to do the flower shop.
We're standing firm at the acreage requirement.
Yeah, so that site is exactly that size. And that was probably the reason why it was done at that acreage.
So does he want to strike it out entirely, or does he want to recommend a smaller size, say 1 acre?
He wants to strike it out entirely.
Other questions? Mr. Sewell.
So you mentioned if we were to change that with the flower shop, and what was the other, you mentioned another use, I think, as well as the flower shop?
Pad. It was a pad. The pad.
Pad something.
I said a pad.
Oh, pad. Okay. Yeah, pad site or flower.
So flower shop or a pad.
So you mentioned there's a possibility that it might go over the 250 trip per day and require a second entrance.
Yeah, with the funeral home there and that use, that would generate a certain amount of traffic, and then adding additional sites to that, or additional uses to that same site or would increase that number and could go over that, which would trigger the second access that would be needed. And when the city was going through the process, when the city had control of the property, rezoning it to the SC1 zone, there was a lot of concerns from the neighborhood about traffic and what types of uses would be appropriate and not. And it's not that the flower shop wouldn't be appropriate for the site, it's just that the flower shop and the funeral home together could generate a lot more traffic than the neighborhood might have been comfortable with.
And it would be pretty difficult to put a second access on that particular site, right?
Yeah, because it's not on this site, but the site we're talking about, it's
steep and curved.
Yeah, it's University Avenue is a state road, and so UDOT probably wouldn't want another access.
We don't have any access now from this site to University, do we? There's none at all. It's the only access is on the hotel.
There's a small driveway access to the well house.
For the city.
For the city, which is on a separate parcel, right.
I think that was part of the discussion when we sold it, or when we approved the.
Yeah.
He's not left, the owner is not left without options
No, his plan's been approved for his funeral home, and he's moving forward with that. This would just be an extra way to get value out of the property, to sell that.
The zoning restrictions, is he maxed out on lot coverage? Could he build another building under his ownership?
I think he could. You know, he's got.
But his intent would anything else construction he doesn't want. He wants to sell.
Yeah, he doesn't want to lease another building to somebody. Or well, he doesn't mind leasing it, but I think that
Discuss the possibility of condominiumization, allow him to sell a flat but not utilize the subdivision process.
Yeah, we've discussed that, and as staff, we felt that the 1.75 acre requirement is for the funeral home use, and so if a portion of that, even though he still owns it, is under a separate use, then he technically wouldn't be maintaining that acreage requirement for.
So the ordinance actually says
for a mortuary they need 1.75 acres for that use. So if part of the property was delegated to a different use, we felt like that it wouldn't be filling that.
Would you mind going to one of those pictures of one of those sites and explaining to me what the ordinance would do? Should we adopt it just next, not this week? That one.
Where is this?
This is the old bank.
It's now owned by the university, Old Far West Bank building.
So if the ordinance was changed as proposed, a property like this that's currently zoned as C1 could have a funeral home use placed on this property, and it's adjacent to a residential neighborhood.
So we're specifically talking funeral homes.
Funeral homes, yes.
Okay.
As I recall, that was the motive for this particular allowance. One time.
Yeah, and if you look at that zone, it's uses that are that serve daily needs for a residential neighborhood. So that's why the mortuary wasn't originally in that zone. It was viewed that it made sense on this site as far as its location and having arterial streets on both sides of it, and not really that close to a residential neighborhood. But in other areas, that might not make sense.
Thank you very much, Jason. Austin. Welcome. From development, a discussion of a request for a zone change from A1.1 agricultural zone to R1.8 and R1.10. One family residential for lot 3, Barrett subdivision generally located at 2312 West Center Street, Fort Utah neighborhood.
So this is actually pretty cut and dry, what it is. This first slide that's on there, you caught a little bit of a glimpse of it. This is the current zoning in the area. As you can see, it's basically a small little portion of ag land that still resides in the middle of some residential areas. The Barrett subdivision is the parcel highlighted in red, and then the two R110 parcels that are directly to the south, or in the southeast corner of that, and it's just a 3-lot subdivision. Really what they're doing is they're actually selling off the flag portion of this flag lot, and the Barretts will maintain the pole portion. So this rezone request is in an effort for the Fisher Farms subdivision, which is this one just directly to the east of that. That's the R18. You can see, does this have a looks like it's dead, but this This portion is Plat A of the Fisher Farms subdivision. Plat B is that larger portion just to the north of that, and he's also in the process of going through the subdivision for that. So this flag portion, he's looking to basically just make that a phase 2 extension of that development. In order to do that, we have required for him, if you've read through the staff report that was presented to Planning Commission, we are requiring him to record Plat B in order to move forward with that subdivision because of this desire for the current owners to maintain that pole portion, which would in essence remove the frontage of this lot were he not to move forward with that. That might also give a little bit of an explanation to the reason why there's a rezoning of R18 on the larger flag portion and R110 to that pole portion. That's just to match what's being utilized right next to it. So, when this went to Planning Commission, they offered a favorable recommendation, again with that condition about the Plat B, making sure that that gets in and done, because that would provide the street frontage that they need for that to actually be subdivided. So, any questions?
So just to clarify, the Plat B subdivision would then provide the road to the second phase.
Yeah, the road continues to the north, and then it actually tees, and one direction heads to the west to that flag portion, and the other actually, if you go down right here, that gives you an idea of what Plat B would look like in that area, and it makes the road connection over there to the east as well. So,
what's the green portion? What's the access going to be to that? Is it going to be cul-de-sac? Are we going to have to cul-de-sac that, or?
Yeah, if you go to the next slide, it is a cul-de-sac. Basically, this is their proposal for that development. Here's the pole portion. It basically gets split in half and sent to the 2 parcels that are already owned by the Barrett brothers, and those will get deeded to each of the other lots because the pole portion alone doesn't meet the lot standards or anything.
Access.
So that's one of the requirements we've made too, is that they actually have to deed those 2 parcels. So it's not this odd remaining parcel that's sitting out there. Anything else? I told you, it's pretty straightforward.
Thank you. Now, Brian Jones, explanatory comment.
Yes, at this time, there's been a request for a closed meeting. The purpose of that closed meeting is to discuss the character and competence of individuals, which is a reason set forth in state code for holding a closed meeting, and therefore it would be appropriate at this time to make a motion to close the meeting and we met to meet together.
Mr. Chair, I make the motion to close the meeting and move to our other room.
Thank you, Mr. Aaron. Second, all in favor? Thank you. Motion has unanimous through Mr. Hales. Let us move. We'll need amendments.
Yeah, that's a good idea. If we can.
Muscle season up.
What's that?
Do you need it?
Okay, great. Thank you so much.